Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. I've been a park ranger for almost 10 years, stationed at various national parks across the country. I've dealt with bears, mountain lions, lost hikers, and every kind of wild animal you can imagine. But nothing, not even my time in the Marines, prepared me for what happened in the Bitterroot National Forest last summer. I haven't told anyone the full story, not even my wife. It's not that I don't want to, it's just, I don't know how to explain what I saw out there. It was mid-July, the height of tourist season. People were pouring into the park, eager for a weekend of camping and hiking. I was stationed in a remote section of the forest, an area known for its dense trees, steep ridges, and winding trails. It was beautiful, but it had a reputation among the rangers, a place where people got lost, where strange things happened. The locals called it Dead Man's Hollow. I'd always thought it was just an old nickname, something to spook new rangers. Turns out it was more than that. On the second night of my patrol, a call came in on the radio around dusk. A family had reported strange noises near their campsite, howling, loud crashes, and what they described as guttural moaning. They were spooked, but no one had been hurt, so I was sent to check it out. No big deal. Animals get rowdy, especially in the summer. Sometimes a coyote or a bobcat can make sounds that'll send shivers down your spine if you're not used to the wild. I hopped in my truck and made the drive out to the trailhead. The family's campsite was about a mile from the road, down a narrow trail that cut through thick pine trees and underbrush. The deeper I went, the darker the forest became. It felt wrong. I know how that sounds, but it's the only way I can describe it. The trees seemed to close in around me, and even the birds were silent. The only sound was my boots crunching on the dirt path and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere out in the dark. When I reached the campsite, the family, 2 parents and their teenage son, were already packed up and ready to leave. They looked shaken, the mother especially. She kept glancing over her shoulder, like she expected something to come out of the trees at any moment. The father was more composed, but his hands were trembling as he talked. "It started just after sunset," he said, pointing into the trees. "Howling, like something was hurt. Then the crashing. Something big was out there, breaking branches, circling the camp." His son chimed in. "We thought it was a bear, but it didn't sound right. The noises were wrong." I asked if they'd seen anything, but they shook their heads. Whatever it was, it had stayed out of sight, just beyond the tree line. I reassured them that it was probably a coyote, or maybe a big buck moving through the brush. They didn't seem convinced, but they were eager to get out of there. I helped them carry their gear back to their car, and after a few more reassurances, they left. I should have left too, but I had to check it out. It was my job after all. I hiked back to the campsite, listening carefully for any unusual sounds. At first there was nothing, just the rustle of the wind through the trees and the distant call of an owl. I circled the perimeter of the campsite, looking for tracks or signs of an animal, but everything seemed normal, until I found the footprints. They were just beyond the edge of the campsite, partially hidden by the underbrush. At first glance they looked like deer tracks, split hooves, deep impressions in the dirt. But as I followed them, they started to change. The prints grew larger, wider, the deep impressions more spaced out, and then they weren't hooves anymore. They were something else. Long, narrow, almost like a human foot, but with claws at the tips. The kind of tracks that shouldn't exist. My heart started to race, but I pushed the panic down. It had to be a bear or maybe even a wolf with an injured paw. My mind was scrambling for a rational explanation. But the more I followed the tracks, the harder it became to believe that. The trail led deeper into the forest, away from the campsite, twisting and turning through dense undergrowth. The trees were so thick now that the sky was barely visible through the canopy, and the shadows felt alive, shifting with every step I took. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural moan, so deep it seemed to vibrate through the ground. It was close. Too close. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed, straining to locate the source of the sound. It came again, louder this time, and accompanied by a crashing noise, something moving through the trees, heavy and deliberate. Whatever it wasn't trying to hide anymore. I should have run. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out of there. But instead, I stepped forward, deeper into the trees, flashlight sweeping the darkness. The air grew colder, and that smell hit me, like rotting meat, sickly sweet and overwhelming. My stomach turned. I stopped when I saw it. In the beam of my flashlight, not more than 20 feet ahead, there was a figure. At first, I thought it was a person, hunched over, back turned toward me. But as the light hit it, the thing rose to its full height, well over 7 feet, and turned slowly to face me. Its body was wrong, twisted. The arms were too long, its legs bent at an unnatural angle. Patches of its skin were stretched too tight over bones, while other parts hung loose, rotting. Its face. God, I'll never forget its face. The eyes were dark, hollow pits, and its mouth was a gaping maw of jagged teeth, almost as if it had been stretched too wide. And it smiled at me. That was enough. I turned and ran, crashing through the trees, not caring about the noise or the branches that whipped against my face. I could hear it behind me, moving fast, faster than anything that size should be able to move. The crashing of branches, that horrible moaning, and, worst of all, the laughter. It was faint, barely audible over my own ragged breaths, but it was there, high-pitched, mocking. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, but it was probably just minutes. By the time I made it back to the trailhead, I couldn't hear it anymore. The forest was silent again. But I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. I never reported what I saw. What could I say? That some creature straight out of a nightmare was prowling the woods? They'd think I'd lost it. Hell, sometimes I wonder if I did. But I know what I saw, and I know I wasn't imagining it. I put in for a transfer not long after that, got stationed at a park out west, where the forests aren't quite so dense, where I can see the sky. But even now, sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear the laughter. I wasn't supposed to be out there deep in the woods of Pine Creek. My friends and I had come for a weekend escape, camping, fishing, and drinking by the fire. It was a well-known spot, but I'd heard stories. The locals didn't like to talk about Pine Creek after dark, but we didn't care. Young and stupid, we shrugged it off as nothing but folklore. That first day was normal enough. We hiked the trails, set up camp near the creek, and cooked over the fire. My best friend Jake had brought a cheap bottle of whiskey, and we passed it around, the cold night air biting at our skin as the fire crackled. The woods were so thick, the trees so close together, that the campfire felt like the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. It was when the ranger came that things started feeling off. He appeared out of nowhere, stepping silently out of the trees like he'd been watching us. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform neat but old, like it had seen decades of wear. His face was blank, eyes hollow and dark, but his smile, it didn't reach those eyes. "Y'all better be careful out here," he said, his voice too quiet for his size. "Strange things happen in these parts." He stared at me for too long before turning and disappearing back into the trees, not making a sound as he left. We laughed it off, pretending it didn't creep us out, but I noticed the way the others shifted uneasily after he'd gone. That night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. I figured it was one of my friends taking a midnight leak, but when I glanced out of my tent, no one was there. Only the dying embers of the fire remained, casting a dim glow around the campsite. I lay back down, trying to brush off the unease, but the footsteps returned, closer this time, circling the camp. They were heavy, deliberate, and slow. My heart began to pound as I strained to listen. Then came the voice, low and gravelly, just outside my tent. "Help me!" I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't one of my friends. The voice sounded wrong, like it was broken, like someone was trying to imitate a human voice but didn't quite know how. "Please, help me." I clenched my fists, too terrified to move. The voice repeated, circling the camp. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable, stretching on for what felt like hours. When I finally found the courage to unzip the tent and peek out, nothing was there, but something was wrong. The air was thick, suffocating. The trees looked taller, darker, pressing in on the campsite. The next morning I asked if anyone else had heard the voice. Jake just shook his head, but he looked pale, like he hadn't slept. The others laughed it off, teasing me about ghost stories, but the unease lingered between us. We hiked further into the woods that afternoon, looking for a spot to fish along the creek. The trees were even denser here, branches clawing at the sky. The path was narrow, and the sunlight barely filtered through, but it wasn't until we stumbled upon the cabin that things took a turn for the worse. It was old, rotting, barely standing. The windows were smashed and the door hung off its hinges. The others dared each other to go inside, but I stayed back, something gnawing at my gut. There was a smell in the air, sour like decaying meat. And then I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the tree line watching us. At first I thought it was the ranger again, but as I squinted I realized it wasn't. It was taller, thinner, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't move, just stood there watching. I opened my mouth to say something, but before I could, Jake shouted from inside the cabin. I rushed over, heart racing, and found him standing in the doorway, pale as a ghost. He pointed to the floor where a set of claw marks had been scratched deep into the wood, the marks fresh. The others crowded around, but no one said a word. That night back at camp, the mood had changed. We kept the fire burning bright, no one straying too far from the light. Jake wouldn't stop fidgeting, his eyes darting toward the trees like he was expecting something to jump out. He hadn't said much since the cabin, and when he did speak, his voice was shaky, hollow. It was around midnight when we heard it again, the voice. "Help me." It was closer this time, right at the edge of the firelight. We all heard it. There was no denying it now. Jake grabbed his flashlight, shining it into the trees, but there was nothing there. Just darkness. The voice came again, more desperate. "Please, help me." Suddenly something moved in the trees, just beyond the light, a figure barely visible. We all jumped to our feet, eyes wide. But when Jake pointed his flashlight, the figure was gone. Then, without warning, the fire blew out. Panic set in. The darkness swallowed us whole, and we could hear movement all around. Branches snapping, footsteps crunching in the leaves. Something was out there, circling us. I grabbed my own flashlight, my hands trembling, and shined it wildly around the camp. That's when I saw it. Standing at the edge of the camp was the same figure from earlier, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. It wasn't human. Its skin was pale, stretched thin over its bones, and its limbs were unnaturally long, fingers ending in sharp black claws. It moved with a jerking, unnatural motion, its head tilting from side to side as it watched us. Jake screamed and ran toward the car, but before he could get far, something large and fast darted out from the trees, tackling him to the ground. He screamed again, but the sound was quickly muffled by the sound of flesh tearing. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The others scattered, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the thing that was now dragging Jake's body into the darkness, its glowing eyes fixed on me. Then, just as quickly as it began, the woods fell silent again. I don't remember how long I stood there staring into the blackness, waiting for something to happen. When I finally gathered the courage to move, I stumbled to the ranger station, gasping for breath. But when I burst through the door, the ranger from before was there, sitting at the desk, waiting, his hollow eyes fixed on me. "They don't like it when you wander too far," he said, a slow grin creeping across his face. "The forest keeps what it wants." I ran. I didn't stop running until I was miles from Pine Creek, my mind racing, heart pounding. I didn't go back for my friends. I couldn't. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear that voice, whispering from the dark, "Help me." I've always loved the woods. They've been a part of me since I was a kid, hiking with my dad through the forests of northern Michigan. The smell of pine, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the feeling of being utterly alone in the wild. It's where I feel most at peace. That's why I became a park ranger. It seemed like the perfect way to spend my life, surrounded by the nature I loved, helping others enjoy it too. But there's something no one tells you about the deep woods, something they don't put in the brochures or the training manuals. There are places in the forest where things happen, things that don't make sense, things you can't explain, places where the forest is different, darker. And if you're unlucky enough to find one of those places, you don't forget it. I found one of those places. It was late in the season, the tourists had mostly packed up and gone, and I was on a solo patrol near Shadow Lake. The area doesn't see much traffic, too remote, too hard to get to, but it's beautiful, especially in the fall, with the leaves turning orange and red, the lake a perfect mirror of the sky. I'd been patrolling that area for a couple of years by then, knew the trails like the back of my hand, but on this day, I decided to take a route I'd never tried before. There was an old logging road long abandoned that cut through the deeper part of the forest. It hadn't been maintained in decades, and I figured it might be good to check it out, see if it needed marking as off-limits. I set off early in the morning, the sun just starting to rise. The woods were quiet, the air crisp with the scent of fall. I followed the main trail for a few miles, then cut off toward the old logging road. It was overgrown as I expected, the path barely visible beneath the layers of fallen leaves and brambles. But I didn't mind. I liked the solitude, the challenge of navigating a place that hadn't been touched by people in years. About an hour in, the woods started to change. The air got colder, and the trees grew thicker, their branches twisted together like they were trying to block out the sky. The sunlight, which had been filtering through the leaves in patches, was now almost completely gone, leaving the forest in an eerie twilight. That's when I noticed the first sign that something was off. The birds were gone. Up until that point, I'd been hearing the usual forest sounds, birds calling, squirrels chattering, the rustle of leaves in the wind. But now, it was silent. Completely silent. Not even the wind was moving through the trees anymore. It was like the forest was holding its breath. I told myself it was just the isolation, that I was overthinking it. But then I saw the footprints. They were huge, larger than any bear tracks I'd ever seen. And they weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. The prints were deep, and the shape. It wasn't right. They looked almost human, but longer, with claw marks at the toes. I kneeled down to get a better look, my skin prickling with unease. That's when the smell hit me. It was like something rotting, thick, sour, and overpowering. It made me gag, and I had to cover my nose with my sleeve just to keep from throwing up. I stood up, heart pounding, suddenly very aware of how alone I was. The woods felt wrong. The silence was oppressive, and the air, it was thick, almost heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I glanced around, half expecting to see something lurking in the trees, but there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of forest, dark and still. I should have turned back then. Every instinct in my body was telling me to leave, but I didn't. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I didn't want to admit to myself that I was scared. I kept walking, deeper into the woods, following the old logging road as it twisted through the trees. The footprints were still there, leading the same direction I was going. And then, after what felt like hours, I came across something that stopped me dead in my tracks. It was an old abandoned campsite, tents collapsed and rotting, the fabric torn and weathered, rusted camping gear scattered across the ground, covered in a thick layer of dirt and leaves. But it wasn't the decay that bothered me. It was the fact that it looked like it had been there for years. and no one had reported it. Not once in all my time working this area had I heard of a missing camper or an abandoned site. I walked toward it cautiously. The smell was stronger here, almost unbearable, and then I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the edge of the campsite, partially buried in the dirt, was a boot. A human boot. And sticking out of the boot was a bone, white, cracked, and old. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. Someone had died here, but there was no record of it, no reports, nothing. I was about to radio it in when I heard something, a low, guttural sound, like a growl coming from the trees behind me. My breath caught in my throat as I turned slowly, every muscle tensed. At first I didn't see anything, just the trees, silent and still. But then I saw movement, something shifting in the shadows between the trunks. It was tall, taller than any man, and it moved in a way that wasn't natural, jerking, like it didn't quite know how to use its limbs. And then it stepped into the clearing. It was wrong. Its body was elongated, thin, with arms that hung too long, almost reaching the ground. Its skin was pale, gray, stretched tight over its bones. But its face, God, its face. It was like a twisted mockery of a human face with sunken black eyes and a mouth that hung open, too wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. I froze, too terrified to move as it stared at me, its head cocking to the side like it was curious. And then, slowly, it opened its mouth wider and let out a sound that still haunts my nightmares. It was a scream, high-pitched, inhuman, like metal scraping on metal. It pierced the silence, cutting through the air like a knife. I bolted. I don't know how I managed it, but my legs kicked into gear, and I ran faster than I ever have in my life. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees blurring past as I sprinted back down the trail. Behind me, I could hear it, crashing through the woods, its footsteps heavy and erratic. I don't remember much about the run back, it's all a blur. But somehow I made it to the ranger station, slammed the door behind me and locked it. I collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath, every inch of me trembling. I never went back to that part of the forest. I filed the report about the abandoned campsite, but I left out the part about the creature. No one would believe me anyway. But I know what I saw. And I know it's still out there. The woods aren't empty. They're not peaceful, not in the way people think. Something else is in there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for you to stray too far from the path. And if you're unlucky enough to find it, you won't come back, just like those hikers. I never believed in the stories, the ones about the woods near my hometown. I'd heard the legends growing up, tales of strange creatures and lost souls that lurked between the trees, but they were always just that, stories. Local folklore, passed down through generations to scare kids from wandering too far into the forest. I thought they were harmless, just ghost tales to spice up campfires. That all changed last fall. It was supposed to be a quick overnight camping trip. Just me, my buddy Tom, and a couple of beers by the fire. We'd done it before, nothing special. The trail we took was one that people rarely used anymore, leading deep into the heart of the forest. We wanted solitude, and we got it. By the time we set up camp, the sun was sinking behind the trees, casting long, thin shadows across the clearing. The forest seemed unnaturally still. No birds, no rustling of leaves, just quiet. I tried not to let it bother me, but there was something about the way the silence hung in the air that felt wrong. Tom didn't seem to notice, though. He was cracking jokes, making light of the isolation. As night fell, the fire crackled and popped, casting a warm glow around our little camp. Tom and I sat there laughing and swapping stories, trying to ignore the way the woods seemed to close in around us. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often I'd catch myself glancing into the trees, half expecting to see someone or something standing there, hidden in the darkness. Around midnight, Tom decided to take a walk. He said he wanted to stretch his legs, maybe take a piss, and would be back in a few minutes. I didn't think much of it at the time. I stayed by the fire, feeding it more wood, letting the warmth chase away the chill that was creeping into my bones. Minutes passed, then 20, then 30. Tom hadn't come back, and I stood up, grabbing the flashlight from my pack, and called out his name. No answer. Just the wind stirring through the branches overhead, whispering like a voice I couldn't quite make out. A knot of unease formed in my stomach as I shined the light into the forest, illuminating nothing but trees and darkness. I called for him again, louder this time, my voice echoing through the night. Still nothing. My heart started to pound. Tom wasn't the type to wander off without a word, especially not in the middle of the night in unfamiliar woods. I stepped toward the edge of the clearing, the flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. The beam danced over the undergrowth, casting long shadows that twisted and stretched like they were alive. "Tom!" I shouted, my voice breaking the oppressive silence. And then I heard it, a voice, faint, almost muffled, coming from deep within the forest. "Help me!" It was Tom's voice, weak and shaky, like he was hurt. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I couldn't just leave him out there. He needed me. Swallowing the lump in my throat, I took a step into the trees, shining the flashlight ahead of me. "Tom?" I called again, my voice shaking. "Where are you? Help me!" The voice came again, closer now, but wrong. It sounded like Tom, but not quite right, like someone was imitating him. A chill ran down my spine. The stories, the legends, they rushed back into my mind, flooding me with a dread I couldn't explain. But I kept moving, pushing deeper into the woods. The underbrush was thick, the branches clawing at my clothes as I stumbled forward. The further I went, the colder it got. The air felt heavy, pressing down on me like a weight, making it hard to breathe. "Tom!" I shouted again, my voice cracking. "Here!" His voice responded, barely a whisper now, so close I should have been able to see him. I swung the flashlight around frantically, the beam cutting through the darkness in wild arcs. And then I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the reach of the light. At first I thought it was Tom. He was standing there still and silent, his face hidden in shadow. Relief washed over me, and I started toward him, but something stopped me dead in my tracks. He wasn't moving. "Tom?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He didn't respond, didn't even blink. I took a step closer, the flashlight shaking in my hand as the beam fell on his face. My breath caught in my throat. It looked like Tom, same clothes, same face, but there was something horribly wrong with him. His eyes were wide, too wide, staring at me with a vacant, dead expression. His mouth was open, but no sound came out. Just that blank, empty stare. "Help me," he whispered again, but the words didn't match the movement of his lips. The voice came from his direction, but not from his mouth. I stumbled back, my mind racing. This wasn't right. This wasn't Tom. Then he moved, not toward me. He twitched, his limbs jerking unnaturally, like a puppet whose strings had been yanked. His head cocked to the side, almost as if he was studying me, and I realized with growing horror that whatever I was looking at wasn't Tom at all. It was something else and wearing his face. I turned and ran, crashing through the trees, branches tearing at my skin, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. Behind me I heard the sound of footsteps, heavy, uneven, following me, gaining on me. "Help me," the voice called again, louder now, echoing through the woods. But it wasn't Tom's voice anymore. It was deeper, guttural, and wrong. I sprinted back to the camp, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the thing moving through the trees, crashing after me, its voice calling out again and again, twisting and distorting. "Help me, help me." I burst into the clearing, gasping for breath, and spun around to face the trees. The fire was still burning low, casting long shadows across the ground, but there was no sign of the figure, no sign of Tom. Just silence. I grabbed my gear, stuffing everything into my pack as quickly as I could, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip it up. I didn't care about the tent or the fire. I just needed to get out. I needed to get away from whatever was out there, wearing my friend's face. As I made for the trail, I heard the voice one last time, soft and distant. Help. Me. But this time, I didn't look back. I never saw Tom again. The search parties went out the next day combing the forest, but they didn't find a trace of him. Not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing, nothing. The official story was that he got lost, maybe injured, and succumbed to the elements, but I know better. Whatever is in those woods, it's still out there, and it's waiting. So if you ever find yourself deep in the forest and you hear a voice calling for help, do yourself a favor. Don't answer. I've always loved camping alone, something about the solitude, the quiet, just me and the wild. It was my way of escaping the noise of everyday life. My friends thought I was crazy for going deep into the woods without any company, but I always shrugged it off. I'd done it countless times without a hitch. But that was before that night. I decided to head up to a place I'd never been before, an isolated stretch of forest in the northern Rockies. A friend of a friend had told me about it. Said it was perfect if you wanted to be truly alone. No trails, no campers, no nothing. The idea of it thrilled me. I wanted the experience of complete isolation. The hike in was peaceful. The trail disappeared after about 5 miles, and I had to bushwhack the rest of the way. By the time I found a decent clearing to set up camp, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the pines. The clearing was perfect, flat, with just enough space for my tent, and surrounded by trees that made it feel like I was in a cocoon of nature. I set up camp quickly, eager to get a fire going before nightfall. As the flames crackled to life, I sat back, enjoying the quiet. No buzzing phones, no voices, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional snap of a branch. But as night settled in, something felt different, off. It wasn't the normal forest sounds. In fact, it was the lack of sounds that caught my attention. The usual chorus of insects and distant hoots of owls were absent. The forest was dead silent. I told myself it was just because I was deep in a remote area, far from any human activity. It didn't mean anything. I had a fire, my gear, and the sky was clear, the stars shining bright overhead. I should have felt at peace, but instead I felt watched. Brushing it off, I crawled into my tent, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and closed my eyes. I must have drifted off for a while because when I woke up, the fire outside had died down to glowing embers. That's when I heard it. A soft, almost rhythmic sound. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon shuffling around outside. But as I lay there, holding my breath, I realized it wasn't footsteps. It was something else. A scraping sound like metal on stone. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest. I listened, straining to make sense of it. It was slow and deliberate, coming from the direction of the tree line. I reached for my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, poking my head out. The clearing was still. My dying fire cast a dim glow, just enough to see the immediate area. But the trees beyond? Nothing but blackness. The scraping sound had stopped. I shined my flashlight toward the trees, sweeping it across the clearing. Nothing. No movement, no animals. Just trees and shadows. I told myself it was probably a branch, rubbing against a rock or maybe an old fence post buried in the undergrowth. Nothing to worry about. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, lurking just beyond the firelight. Watching. I stoked the fire, hoping the flames would chase away whatever anxiety had gripped me, then went back inside the tent, lying there with my eyes wide open, waiting. Maybe an hour passed before I heard it again. This time the sound was closer, much closer, right at the edge of the clearing, a long, slow scrape, like something dragging across the ground. I sat bolt upright, grabbing my flashlight and shining it through the tent's mesh window. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it might burst from my chest. And then, in the dim glow of the fire, I saw something. A shape, hunched low, moving between the trees. I couldn't make it out clearly, but it was big. Too big to be a deer, too tall to be any kind of animal I'd seen out here. It moved strangely, almost jerking, like it wasn't used to walking on two legs. I stayed frozen, barely breathing, watching as it slowly moved along the edge of the clearing, just outside the reach of the firelight. And then it stopped. It stood there facing my tent, and I swear I saw two glowing eyes reflecting in the darkness. I thought about grabbing the knife I kept in my pack, but what good would it do? I was miles from anyone, completely alone with whatever was out there. Running wouldn't help. There was no way I could outrun it, not in the dark. I did the only thing I could think of. I doused the fire. In hindsight, I don't know why I did it. Maybe I thought the darkness would make me invisible, that whatever was watching me would lose interest if it couldn't see me. But after the fire went out, the scraping sound returned, closer now, louder. And then I heard breathing. Low, heavy breathing, like something huge was right outside my tent. My hand shook as I gripped the flashlight, terrified to shine it in the direction of the sound. I was too scared to move, too scared to even blink. I just sat there, listening, my whole body rigid with fear. And then, without warning, the tent walls bulged inward like something was pressing against it, pushing in on all sides. I scrambled backward, my mind racing, but there was nowhere to go. It was right there, just on the other side of the thin fabric, pressing in, testing the boundaries. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the pressure stopped. The tent walls returned to normal, and the heavy breathing faded into the night. The silence returned, but now it was even more oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. I don't know how long I stayed like that, frozen, flashlight in hand, listening to the silence. Minutes? Hours? I didn't sleep at all that night. At the first light of dawn, I threw open the tent and packed my things as fast as I could. The clearing looked the same as it had the day before, except for one thing. A deep, jagged groove cut into the earth, circling the tent, like something had dragged its claws through the dirt while I slept. I didn't stick around to inspect it. I just grabbed my gear and started hiking back to the car. Every step felt like I was being watched. I kept my eyes straight ahead, refusing to look back, refusing to acknowledge that something had followed me through the woods the entire time. When I finally reached my car and slammed the door shut, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been out there was still watching me, waiting. I haven't been camping alone since that night, and I never will again. Some places aren't meant to be explored alone. I always thought the woods were peaceful, even magical in a way. That was before I spent a night alone at High Pines, deep in the heart of Blackwater National Forest. It's a place that doesn't show up on most maps. Park rangers rarely mention it unless you're looking for something off the beaten path. I'm not sure what exactly drew me there. Some need to escape, to lose myself in the wild. It wasn't my first solo camping trip, but something felt off as soon as I crossed the threshold of those towering pines. The air seemed heavier, like the trees themselves were watching. Maybe it was just the isolation, the silence that stretched out for miles, broken only by the wind whispering through the branches. Or maybe it was the strange, uneasy feeling that had settled in my gut. I set up camp near a small clearing by dusk, close to the remnants of an old ranger station, now nothing more than a forgotten skeleton of logs and moss. The structure felt wrong, abandoned for reasons I couldn't quite put my finger on. The forest surrounding it seemed darker, thicker somehow, as though the trees were closing in. I convinced myself it was just the eeriness of being alone in such a remote place. I built a fire, hoping the light would chase away the creeping shadows. As the flames flickered and cast long dancing shapes around me, I began to notice something strange. There were no sounds, no birds, no insects, just nothing. The kind of silence that swallows everything whole. It was unnatural. My nerves were already on edge, but when I heard the first crack in the underbrush, it felt like a knife through my spine. Probably a deer, I muttered to myself, but my voice sounded hollow, almost absurd in the suffocating quiet. I stared into the woods, searching for movement, but saw only darkness, thick and impenetrable. Then I heard it again, closer this time, deliberate. Something was out there watching. I told myself it was just an animal. But then came the smell, rancid and overpowering, like rotting meat mixed with something else, something earthy and sickly sweet. I gagged, covering my nose, and stepped closer to the fire, my eyes darting between the trees. My mind raced, conjuring images of wolves, bears. But none of them explained the smell, or the sense of being hunted. I heard a low growl, almost too soft to catch, but there was no mistaking it. It wasn't human, and it wasn't like any animal I had ever heard. My heart pounded in my chest as the sound circled the camp, moving too fast, too deliberately. I grabbed my flashlight, pointing it into the woods, but the beam seemed weak against the oppressive darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw something. A tall, hunched figure, its eyes glowing faintly in the distance. But as soon as I focused on it, it was gone, swallowed by the trees. The growling stopped, replaced by another sound, something far more disturbing. Laughter. But it wasn't right. It was distorted, mimicking the sound of human laughter, but with a jagged, inhuman edge. It echoed around the clearing as if the forest itself was mocking me. I grabbed my hunting knife, backing up until I was almost inside the old ranger station. The structure groaned under my weight, as though it resented my presence, but at least it felt like a barrier. The laughter continued, growing louder, more maniacal. Then it stopped, replaced by a voice, my voice. It called out to me, repeating my name slowly at first, then faster, more urgent. But there was no mistaking it. It was my own voice, calling from the woods. A cold chill swept through me. I stumbled back, knocking over a rusted lantern. My voice, how was that possible? I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. I just stood there, frozen as something large moved just beyond the tree line. I didn't want to see it, but I had to. My flashlight flickered, catching something massive standing upright. Its eyes glowed an unnatural yellow, and its face. It was wrong. The features twisted, stretched, somewhere between human and animal. Its body was covered in matted fur, but its skin, where visible, was slick and pale, as though it had never seen sunlight. And then it smiled. I swear it smiled. A wide, toothy grin that split its face unnaturally wide. The smell returned, stronger this time, and I gagged again. The creature began to move, but not towards me. Instead, it circled the clearing, faster and faster, making no sound except for the crunch of twigs beneath its heavy, clawed feet. I ducked into the ranger station, barricading myself behind the splintered door, hoping the flimsy structure would hold. I could hear it outside, pacing, laughing again, mocking me. And then it stopped, as though it had lost interest. I held my breath, straining to hear, but there was only silence once more. Hours passed. The fire outside had died to embers, and I finally dared to peek through a crack in the wall. The clearing was empty, save for the shadows of the trees. That's when I saw it, not the creature, but something worse. A figure in the distance, walking slowly through the trees. It looked human, almost, but its movements were jerky, unnatural. As it came closer, I recognized the clothes. It was a park ranger's uniform. I almost laughed with relief, thinking maybe help had come. But as it stepped into the moonlight, I realized my mistake. Its skin was ashen, its eyes hollow, and its mouth was stretched wide in that same horrifying grin. It raised one skeletal arm, beckoning me forward. And then I heard it, my voice coming from its throat. "Come here," it said. "You're safe now." But I wasn't. When I turned to run, I tripped over something on the floor. I scrambled to my feet, shining the flashlight on the object. It was a rotting park ranger's hat, covered in dried blood. Beneath it was a pile of bones, still dressed in the tattered remains of a uniform. That's when I understood. The thing in the clearing wasn't just mimicking voices, it was wearing faces. I never saw it again after I fled the woods that night. But I hear stories from time to time, hikers who never return, strange laughter echoing through the trees. And sometimes, late at night, I hear my own voice calling from the woods, and I wonder if one day it will come back for me. I never should have gone camping alone. It had been a long time since I'd felt the need to disconnect, but the pressure of city life was gnawing at me, and I thought a weekend in the woods would do the trick. So, I packed light and drove north to a stretch of wilderness known as Wolf Hollow. It was remote, barely marked on any maps, and that was exactly what I needed. The moment I stepped out of the car, I felt it. The air in Wolf Hollow was wrong. Heavy, too still, like even the wind didn't dare pass through the trees. I shrugged off the unease, telling myself it was just the unfamiliar solitude. The first red flag came when I stopped by the ranger station to check in. The ranger was a tall, gaunt man with eyes that seemed too small for his face. He didn't smile, didn't welcome me. He just stared, lips slightly parted, like he was waiting for me to say something that would disappoint him. When I told him I was heading into the hollow, he looked out the window, frowning. "Wolf Hollow ain't the place for solo camping, friend. Things happen out there." He didn't elaborate, just handed me a crumpled map, shaking his head. As I left, I caught sight of another ranger, older, grizzled, with a strange limp, watching me from behind a tree. His gaze felt like a weight on my back as I walked to my car. I tried not to think about it. The first day passed without incident. I set up camp in a clearing, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to press in from all sides. The canopy was so dense that the sun barely reached the forest floor, casting long, ominous shadows even in broad daylight. As night fell, the woods came alive with sounds, rustling leaves, distant calls of animals, the occasional crack of a branch. But around midnight, the noises stopped. Completely. No wind, no animals, just silence. I lay in my tent, eyes wide open, straining to hear anything. Then came a sound that cut through the quiet, a low, guttural growl. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It was closer, deeper, more deliberate. I felt my skin prickle with fear. The growl echoed once, twice, and then nothing. I lay there, heart hammering in my chest, until exhaustion finally took over. The next morning I found deep claw marks on a tree about 30 feet from my tent, long, jagged gouges that dug into the bark like something had been sharpening its claws. I should have left right then, but I didn't. I convinced myself it was just a bear or some other animal. The second night was worse, much worse. I had barely drifted off to sleep when I heard voices. At first I thought it was other campers, maybe passing nearby, but as I listened, my stomach twisted. The voices were strange, too soft, too distorted, like someone was trying to mimic human speech but didn't quite know how. They whispered just beyond the light of my campfire, circling the clearing. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, mocking. Then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate thuds, pacing just beyond my line of sight. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it into the trees. Nothing. But I knew. Something was there, watching. That's when I heard the laughter. High-pitched, breathy giggles like a child's, but warped, stretched into something unnatural. It came from every direction at once, as if the forest itself was laughing at me. My pulse quickened. I grabbed the map, the one the ranger had given me, thinking I could leave before dawn, but something on the map had changed. The trail I had taken to get here was gone. In its place was a jagged, twisting line that led deeper into the forest, ending at a mark I hadn't noticed before, an X, right in the heart of Wolf Hollow. I didn't sleep after that. At first light I packed up and started back toward where I thought my car was. But no matter how far I walked, the trees seemed to stretch on forever. The path twisted in ways I didn't recognize, leading me in circles. Hours passed, but there was no sign of the trailhead. No sound of the nearby river I had crossed on the way in. Just more trees and more silence. It wasn't until late afternoon that I stumbled upon something strange. A campsite, abandoned, the fire long dead. There were 3 tents and gear strewn about as if whoever had been there left in a hurry. But no people and no tracks. That's when I found the journal. It belonged to another camper, someone who had come to Wolf Hollow a few weeks before. The entries were frantic, desperate. Warnings about creatures in the woods, about something stalking them from the shadows. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. They're not animals. They're wearing their skins. They mimic voices. Don't trust the rangers. I dropped the journal and backed away from the campsite, my heart racing. The sun was setting and the woods were growing darker by the second. I had to get out. But as I turned to leave, I saw something moving in the distance. At first it looked like a deer, but it was too tall, standing on 2 legs. Its skin was stretched tight over its body, the limbs unnaturally long, the joints bending the wrong way. It stared at me with hollow black eyes, and then it smiled, a grotesque skin-splitting grin. I ran. Branches whipped at my face, my lungs burning as I sprinted through the undergrowth. But no matter how fast I ran, I could hear them behind me. The footsteps, the laughter, closer and closer. I tripped, falling hard onto the ground, and as I looked up, I saw them. The rangers. They stood in a circle around me, but their faces weren't right. Their skin sagged, their eyes were too small, and their mouths hung open in unnatural, permanent grins. Behind them, the creatures, those things wearing animal skins, lurked, half hidden in the trees, watching with hungry eyes. The older ranger stepped forward, his grin widening. "You were always part of this place," he rasped. "The forest remembers." And then I understood. I had been drawn here, not by the need to escape the city, but by something much older. Something deep within these woods had called me back. The forest, the creatures, the rangers. They were all part of it, part of me. This was no camping trip. It was a return to where I belonged. And as the creatures closed in, their whispers growing louder, I knew there was no leaving Wolf Hollow. Not ever. I was home. I had always been fascinated by the idea of disappearing into the wilderness, living off the grid for a few days, alone with my thoughts and the untamed beauty of nature. So, when I heard about the Clearwater Pines, a vast remote forest deep in the Pacific Northwest, I didn't hesitate to plan a solo trip. It was supposed to be peaceful, rejuvenating, but what I found there was far from it. The forest was legendary among hikers and campers, not for its beauty, though it was stunning, but for the strange stories that surrounded it. Stories about hikers who never returned, about strange lights and sounds in the night. But I didn't believe in those kinds of things. I'm a rational person. I thought the stories were just that, stories. I arrived early in the morning, mist hanging low over the trees. The air was damp, cold, and still. The trailhead was deserted, as I'd expected. This wasn't a place that attracted casual hikers. You had to really want to be out here to make the trip. I slung my pack over my shoulders and set off, following the narrow, overgrown trail that snaked deeper into the woods. The trees here were ancient, tall, thick, and gnarled, their branches intertwined to create a canopy that blocked out most of the light. The deeper I went, the darker it got, despite the fact that the sun was high in the sky. For the first few hours, everything was normal, peaceful even. I could hear the sounds of birds, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the occasional snap of a twig beneath my boots. But then, as the afternoon wore on, the forest seemed to change. The sounds of life gradually faded, until there was nothing but silence. And that's when I noticed it. The trees around me had started to look different. They were taller, their trunks twisted in ways that didn't seem natural. The bark was darker, almost black, and there was a strange, oily sheen to it. The branches overhead were so dense now that barely any light filtered through. It felt like I had crossed some invisible threshold into a different part of the forest, a place that didn't welcome visitors. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease creeping up my spine. I'd been hiking all day, and I was tired. Maybe I was just imagining things. I checked my map and compass, orienting myself. According to the map, I should have been near Clearwater Creek by now, where I planned to set up camp, but I hadn't seen any sign of water. Frustrated, I pressed on, hoping the creek would appear soon. But as the minutes dragged into hours, it became clear that something was wrong. The trail had all but disappeared, and I felt like I was walking in circles. Every tree looked the same, twisted, dark, and foreboding. By the time the sun started to set, panic had begun to set in. I was lost, deep in a part of the forest that didn't feel right. I set up camp quickly, deciding that it was better to stop for the night than to wander aimlessly in the dark. I built a small fire, though the wood here seemed damp and reluctant to burn. The flames were weak, casting flickering shadows that only made the forest seem more menacing. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. The air grew heavy with the scent of wet earth and decay, a smell I hadn't noticed during the day. I huddled close to the fire, trying to ignore the oppressive darkness that surrounded me. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The first sound came just after midnight, a faint rustling in the trees, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I tensed, gripping my flashlight, and shone it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and undergrowth. Still, the sound continued, growing louder, closer. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" No answer. The rustling stopped, and for a moment there was only silence. Then, from deep within the forest, I heard something else. A low, guttural growl, so faint I thought I might have imagined it. My heart pounded in my chest, and I scanned the trees, trying to see something, anything. But the forest remained still, unnervingly quiet. I sat there for what felt like hours, my nerves frayed, waiting for something to happen. But the night stretched on, cold and silent, until exhaustion finally overtook me. I dozed off despite my fear. I woke suddenly, my eyes snapping open to total darkness. The fire had gone out, and the temperature had dropped even further. I could see my breath in the air, each exhale a cloud of white mist. My skin prickled with a deep instinctual sense of dread. Then I heard it again, the growl. But this time it was much closer. I grabbed my flashlight, my hand shaking, and flicked it on. The beam wavered as I shone it into the woods, my heart racing. For a moment I thought I saw something, a figure, tall and thin, standing just beyond the trees. But it was gone before I could focus on it, disappearing into the shadows. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. Whatever it was circling me, watching me. I could feel it. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I had no idea which direction to run. I was lost, and there was something out there hunting me. I backed toward my tent, trying to think, trying to calm myself. But then I heard it again. This time, a voice. A whisper, faint but clear, coming from the trees. "Come closer." My blood ran cold. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't a human voice. It was distorted, like it was trying to mimic speech but didn't quite know how. I swallowed hard, every muscle in my body tense. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Come closer," the voice repeated, this time from a different direction. I spun around, shining the light wildly through the trees, but there was nothing there. Just shadows. Just darkness. I grabbed my pack and bolted. I didn't care which direction I was going anymore. I just had to get away. I ran through the forest, my flashlight bouncing wildly, branches slashing at my face and arms. The voice followed me, always just behind, whispering, urging me to come closer. I didn't stop until I stumbled out of the trees and onto a dirt road, panting and drenched in sweat. My legs burned and my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I kept running, desperate to put as much distance between me and whatever was in those woods as possible. When I finally reached my car at the trailhead, I collapsed into the driver's seat, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. I sped away, not daring to look back. I never reported what happened. Who would believe me? I barely believe it myself. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back to Clearwater Pines. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that voice, faint and distant, calling to me. Come closer. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just me and a couple of friends escaping the city for some peace in the deep woods. Chris had found a remote camping spot online, some obscure place in a national park no one seemed to visit anymore. Perfect for us, away from everything, no noise, no distractions, just nature. The drive up took hours. We lost cell service about 30 minutes into the winding roads leading deeper into the forest. At first we joked about it, how we were going off the grid, how we'd be living like cavemen for a few days. But as the trees grew denser, swallowing the light bit by bit, a sense of unease crept in. None of us said it aloud, but we all felt it. The woods didn't feel right. We finally arrived at the campsite just before dusk. The clearing was small, surrounded by thick trees that pressed in on every side. It was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the wind. Just nothing. Chris and Jake started setting up the tents while I gathered firewood. The entire time I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. By the time we got the fire going, night had fully settled in, bringing with it a cold that seemed to seep into our bones. The flames cast flickering shadows that danced at the edge of the clearing, making it hard to tell what was real and what wasn't. We sat around the fire, eating, laughing, trying to shake off the creeping sense of isolation. But even our conversation felt forced, like we were all just waiting for something to happen. Then the sounds began. At first it was subtle. Soft footsteps in the distance, twigs snapping in the underbrush. Chris dismissed it as wildlife, probably deer or some other harmless animal. But the sounds didn't feel random. They circled us, moving from one side of the camp to the other, getting closer. Then they would stop, only to start again a few minutes later. Jake stood up, grabbing the flashlight, and pointed it into the darkness. Probably raccoons or something, he muttered, scanning the tree line. But the beam of light revealed nothing but trees and more darkness. No glowing eyes, no movement. It went on like that for hours, the footsteps, the snapping branches, the growing tension. We tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. Something was out there, and it wasn't an animal. The fire had burned down to embers by the time the growling started. Low, deep, and guttural, like nothing I'd ever heard before. It reverberated through the clearing, making the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. We all froze, eyes wide, listening. The growling came from just beyond the tree line, hidden in the shadows where the light couldn't reach. Chris grabbed his hunting knife, standing up slowly. "Stay calm," he whispered, his voice shaking. "It's probably a wolf or a bear." But I knew better. Wolves didn't sound like that. Bears didn't circle campsites for hours without making themselves known. Whatever was out there, it was something else. The growl came again, closer this time. And then, a snap, a branch breaking under heavy weight. Something huge was moving in the woods. Jake panicked. "We need to get to the car," he said, voice high and tight. "Now." But Chris shook his head. "We can't. If it's a predator, it'll chase us down. We need to stay together, keep the fire going, and make it through the night." I wasn't sure if that was sound advice or just blind hope, but I stayed put, gripping my flashlight as if it would do anything against whatever was out there. Then we saw it. At first it was just a shape, massive and hunched, moving between the trees. The flashlight beam caught it for only a second, but it was enough. Long, matted fur, a twisted body, and eyes that gleamed like wet stones in the dark. Not an animal, not a person. Something in between. It let out another growl, louder this time, the sound vibrating in my chest. My heart was pounding, adrenaline screaming through my veins, but my body wouldn't move. It was like I was frozen in place, unable to do anything but stare at the thing lurking just beyond the firelight. Chris took a step forward, raising his knife. "Get out of here," he yelled, his voice cracking. But the thing didn't move. It just stood there, watching us. Then it laughed. A low, raspy sound that sent chills crawling down my spine. It wasn't a human laugh, more like a mockery of one, a sound that was wrong in every possible way. Jake bolted. He turned and ran into the woods before any of us could stop him, his flashlight bobbing wildly in the dark as he disappeared into the trees. "Jake!" I shouted, but it was too late. He was gone. And then, silence. The creature was gone too. Just like that. The footsteps, the growling, the presence, all of it vanished. But something worse took its place. For hours, Chris and I sat by the fire, waiting. We didn't talk. We barely moved. Every sound, every flicker of the fire made me jump. I kept expecting that thing to come back, but it never did. Then, sometime after midnight, we heard Jake's voice. "Help. Please, help me." It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. Jake's voice, calling from somewhere deep in the woods. Chris jumped to his feet. "Jake, where are you?" he shouted, but there was no response. Just that same oppressive silence. Then again, "Help me." But this time the voice wasn't quite right. It was flat, emotionless, like someone was trying to mimic Jake's voice but didn't know how. "We need to go," I whispered, standing up slowly, my legs shaky. "That's not him." Chris looked at me like I was insane. "What the hell are you talking about? It's Jake. He's out there, lost." But I knew, deep down I knew, that thing, whatever it was, it was using Jake's voice. Chris grabbed his flashlight and started into the woods before I could stop him. I stood there, alone by the dying fire, listening as he called for Jake, his voice fading into the distance. And then silence again. I don't know how long I sat there, staring into the dark, waiting for something to happen. Hours, maybe. But eventually I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Someone or something walking toward the camp. I held my breath, clutching the knife Chris had left behind, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might explode. And then I saw him. Jake stepped into the clearing, his face pale and eyes wide, a strange, crooked smile on his lips. "Hey," he said, his voice calm, almost cheerful. "I'm back." But something was wrong. His movements were stiff, unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. And that smile, it didn't reach his eyes. "Where's Chris?" I asked, my voice shaking. Jake, or whatever was wearing Jake's skin, tilted his head, the smile growing wider. "Don't worry," he said, his voice cold, empty. "You'll see him soon." That's when I realized. The thing in the woods didn't want to hunt us. It wanted to be us. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the car. I never really considered myself the outdoorsy type, but when my girlfriend Sarah convinced me to go on a camping trip with her and two of our friends, Jason and Lisa, I couldn't say no. Sarah loved the woods. She found peace in nature. Me? I was more of a city guy, but I figured, what's the worst that could happen? A couple of days in the woods, away from cell service, just us, a campfire, and the stars. Looking back, I wish I had trusted my instincts. We set out on a Friday afternoon, heading deep into the Pacific Northwest, far from the usual campsites. Sarah had found this secret spot through some hiker's blog, tucked away in a remote forest. It was supposed to be untouched, a perfect escape. The drive took hours, with the last stretch winding through an unmarked gravel road. By the time we arrived, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the dense trees. The place was eerie, quiet in a way that felt unnatural. No birds, no rustling of leaves, just silence, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. "Isn't it amazing?" Sarah asked, her eyes lighting up as she stepped out of the car. "Yeah, sure," I muttered, though something about this place set my teeth on edge. I didn't want to ruin the mood, so I grabbed the tent and helped set up camp. As night fell, we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. Jason and Lisa were laughing, completely at ease. Sarah was curled up next to me, the flames dancing in her eyes. But I couldn't shake this gnawing feeling of unease. It wasn't just the silence. It was something else. A presence, maybe, just beyond the tree line watching. It started small, as these things often do. Around midnight, we heard a distant rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. I glanced up, and so did Jason. "You guys hear that?" he asked, his voice low. "Probably just a deer." Lisa shrugged, brushing it off. "We're in the middle of nowhere. There's bound to be animals." That made sense, but still it felt off. The rustling was deliberate, like it was circling us, moving closer, then stopping. Each time it paused, the silence that followed felt even heavier. We all decided to turn in for the night, and I convinced myself it was nothing. After all, we were just paranoid city folk in the wilderness, right? The tent felt suffocating. I couldn't sleep. Every sound, every creak of the branches or gust of wind had me wide-eyed, staring at the nylon walls. Sarah was already out, her breathing slow and steady. I almost envied her. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and far too close. I froze. The footsteps were slow, dragging through the underbrush, circling our campsite. I could hear them moving just beyond the tent, crunching the leaves underfoot. And then, they stopped, right next to us. I held my breath, listening intently. The fire had burned down to embers, so there wasn't much light outside. But there was something out there. I was sure of it. A faint whisper reached my ears, so low it could have been the wind. But it wasn't. It was words. I couldn't make them out, but they were definitely there, murmuring in a strange cadence like a chant. The hairs on my arms stood up. I gently nudged Sarah, but she didn't stir. My pulse quickened as I strained to hear anything else, but everything had gone quiet again. Just as I was about to dismiss it as my imagination, I saw it. Movement in the corner of my eye through the tent's mesh window. Someone was standing just beyond the tree line. I tried to focus, but my mind couldn't make sense of it. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, and lanky, with long, spindly limbs. Its eyes, God, I'll never forget those eyes, two pale, glowing orbs staring directly at our tent. I blinked, hoping it was some trick of the light, but no, it was there, watching us. I must have gasped because Sarah finally stirred. "What's wrong?" she whispered groggily. I couldn't speak, couldn't take my eyes off the thing outside. But by the time she looked, it was gone, melted back into the shadows. I tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come out right. She rubbed my arm, telling me I was probably dreaming, that we were safe. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I wasn't sure if any of it had been real, but then Jason mentioned something strange over breakfast. "Did you guys hear someone walking around last night?" he asked, looking uneasy. "I thought I heard footsteps and, whispering." Lisa rolled her eyes, but I caught the nervous glance she gave Sarah. I wasn't the only one who had felt it. The day passed without incident, though the air felt charged, like the forest was holding its breath. We stuck close to camp, but every so often I'd catch Jason glancing into the woods, as if expecting something to emerge from the trees. By dusk, I was ready to leave, but Sarah insisted on staying one more night. She'd planned this trip for weeks, and I didn't want to be the one to ruin it. So, reluctantly, I agreed. That night was worse. It started with the sounds again. This time, though, it wasn't just footsteps. There was a low guttural growl that echoed from somewhere deep in the forest, followed by more whispers, louder now, like they were coming from every direction. I sat up in the tent, heart pounding in my chest. The fire outside flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows against the trees. And then I saw it. Several figures, barely visible, standing at the edge of the clearing, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I shook Sarah awake, my voice barely a whisper. "They're back." "What?" she asked, confused and still half asleep. Before I could answer, one of the figures stepped closer, emerging from the trees. It was tall, almost skeletal, with skin stretched tight over its bones. Its face was wrong, twisted, like someone had carved it from wood but hadn't finished the job. And then it smiled, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I scrambled out of the tent, dragging Sarah with me. Jason and Lisa were already outside, staring in horror at the creatures surrounding us. "What the hell is that?" Jason shouted, backing up toward the car. I didn't have an answer. We grabbed whatever we could and ran for the car, the creatures moving slowly toward us, their whispers growing louder, more frantic. As we jumped in and slammed the doors, one of them reached out, its long, bony fingers brushing the window. We sped off down the gravel road, not daring to look back until we were miles away. When we finally stopped, none of us spoke for a long time. The woods, the figures, the whispers, it all felt unreal, like a nightmare we'd collectively shared. But I knew what I'd seen. The next day we tried to talk about it, but every explanation felt hollow. Were they cryptids, skinwalkers? Something older, something darker? I don't know. All I know is that the forest wasn't empty that night, and whatever was out there, it didn't want us to leave. There's a reason locals say you shouldn't camp in the Pine Barrens after dark, but when we booked our trip, I didn't believe in any of that superstitious nonsense. I mean, come on, a creature that's half animal, half human, lurking in the woods, cryptids, skinwalkers. I chalked it all up to urban legends designed to keep tourists out of the more remote parts of New Jersey. If only I'd known then what I know now. It was supposed to be a quick weekend escape, just me, my girlfriend Lisa, and our friend Tony. The three of us had been planning this for weeks, camping under the stars, grilling out, getting away from the noise of the city. We picked a spot in the middle of the Barrens, far from the usual hiking trails. Tony insisted on it, said he wanted to be one with nature. It sounded great at the time. We got there late afternoon, the sun just beginning to dip behind the tree line, casting long shadows that made the forest look almost inviting. We pitched our tent, got a fire going, and started grilling some burgers. It was perfect, until the sun finally disappeared. The first weird thing I noticed was the quiet. The Pine Barrens are usually alive with noise at night, crickets, frogs, owls, but as soon as dusk settled in, the woods went dead silent. Lisa mentioned it first, laughing nervously. "You think maybe we scared the wildlife?" I tried to brush it off. "It's probably just the fire. Animals don't like being around people." Tony shrugged and kept poking at the fire, but I could see the unease in his eyes. It wasn't just quiet, it was too quiet, like the kind of silence that feels wrong. The air around us felt heavier, denser somehow. We all felt it, but none of us wanted to be the first to admit it. Then came the footsteps. At first they were faint, distant, just the soft crunch of something moving through the underbrush. Lisa looked up, her face lit by the firelight, eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Probably just a deer," Tony said a little too quickly. "This place is full of them." But I wasn't so sure. The sound was slow and deliberate, like whatever it was moving toward use, not away. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows that danced just beyond the light. I strained my eyes, peering into the darkness, trying to make out anything moving between the trees. But there was nothing. Just blackness. Minutes passed. The footsteps stopped. We all relaxed a little, trying to laugh it off, but the unease lingered. It wasn't until much later, when we'd crawled into the tent and were trying to sleep, that things started getting weird. I must have dozed off for a bit, but I was jerked awake by a sound that sent ice down my spine. It was a low, guttural growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not an animal, not even close. It sounded almost human, but not quite right. It was like someone, or something, was imitating the sound of a growl, but getting it all wrong. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest. "Lisa, did you hear that?" I whispered, shaking her awake. She sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Hear what?" Then we both heard it. From outside the tent came the distinct sound of footsteps again, slow and heavy, circling us. I could hear the twigs snapping underfoot, the deliberate pace sending a jolt of fear through my veins. Tony was still snoring in the corner, oblivious to it all. Lisa grabbed my arm, her grip tight. "What is that?" I didn't have an answer. Every instinct in my body was screaming to stay still, to not make a sound. I reached over and grabbed the flashlight, turning it on. The beam cut through the darkness inside the tent, but I didn't dare unzip the flap and look outside. The footsteps stopped again right next to us. There was a moment of deafening silence, and then, scratch, 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 something was dragging its claws, no fingers, down the side of the tent, slow and deliberate. I felt Lisa tremble beside me, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My mouth went dry as I strained to listen for anything, any sign that whatever was out there had moved on, but the scratching continued. I could barely breathe. And then it spoke. I swear to God I'll never forget that voice. It was low, raspy, like someone who hadn't spoken in years, but it was off, like it was trying to imitate a human voice but didn't quite know how. And it said in a harsh whisper, "Let me in." Lisa's grip on my arm tightened. I could hear her trying not to cry, her body shaking. My own mind raced. Was someone out there? Was it some psycho messing with us? But how would they have found us all the way out here? Then it said it again, this time louder. "Let me in." The voice was closer now, right on the other side of the tent wall. And that's when I noticed the shape pressing against the fabric. There was a face pressed against the tent wall right next to where we were sitting. But it wasn't a person. Its features were distorted, warped, like someone had tried to sculpt a human face out of wet clay and failed miserably. The eyes were hollow, empty sockets, and the mouth, it was just a wide, gaping hole, too large for the face it sat on. Lisa let out a scream, and that's when Tony woke up. "What the hell's going on?" he asked groggily, but before I could respond, the thing outside the tent let out a deafening screech. It was so loud, so sharp, that it felt like knives stabbing into my ears. I didn't think. I just grabbed the knife I'd packed for camping, unzipped the tent, and bolted outside. Lisa and Tony followed close behind, all of us stumbling into the cold night air. The fire had gone out, leaving the clearing bathed in moonlight. I spun around, expecting to see whatever had been out there, but the woods were still, quiet. Not a sound, not a single trace of what had just happened. But I knew it wasn't over. Then I saw it. Standing just at the edge of the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, was the thing. It was tall, much taller than any person, its limbs too long, its posture hunched and wrong. And its face, that same distorted face I'd seen pressing against the tent. It tilted its head at us, and that horrible voice came again, soft, almost playful this time. "Let me in." Without thinking, we ran. We didn't even bother packing up our things. We just bolted for the car, sprinting through the woods like our lives depended on it, and maybe they did. I didn't look back, not once, but I swear I could feel it watching us the whole way. When we finally reached the car, we peeled out of there so fast I nearly lost control of the wheel. It wasn't until we were back on the highway, miles from that cursed campsite, that any of us spoke. "What the hell was that?" Tony asked, his voice shaky. None of us had an answer. The next day we went back with a few rangers to grab our stuff. Everything was there, untouched, except for the tent. It was shredded, like something with claws had torn through it during the night. We never spoke about it again. Not really. But I can tell you this. Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still hear that voice, whispering just outside my window. Let me in. There's something about the stillness of the woods at night that unnerves me now. I used to love it, the isolation, the quiet, the way the world feels like it shrinks down to just the flicker of your campfire. But after what happened last fall, I haven't set foot in the forest again. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. Just me, my girlfriend Laura, and our dog, Scout. We picked a spot deep in the national forest, a place we'd camped before. It was far from the designated campgrounds, well off any trails, a place where we could really get away. No phone signal, no other people, just the three of us in the wilderness. The drive out there took most of the day, but we reached the clearing in time to set up camp before sunset. It was the perfect spot, nestled between tall pines with a little creek running nearby. I remember standing there, taking in the smell of pine needles and earth, feeling the cool breeze brush my face. It felt like freedom. We spent the evening by the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories like we always did. Scout was dozing happily by the fire, and Laura was leaning against my shoulder, her hair smelling faintly of wood smoke. Everything felt right. But then, just after dark, Scout started acting strange. He was a calm dog, never one to bark without reason, but out of nowhere he shot up, ears pricked, and started growling low in his throat. He stared into the trees, his eyes locked on something we couldn't see. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it in the direction he was focused on, but there was nothing. Just the dark shapes of trees swaying in the wind. Probably just a deer, I said, trying to reassure myself as much as Laura. But Scout wasn't buying it. His growl deepened, his hackles raised. He took a few steps toward the tree line, never breaking his gaze. "Come here, boy," I called, my voice tight. He ignored me, inching closer to the woods, his nose twitching like he had caught a scent. Laura grabbed his collar, pulling him back to the fire. He whined, his eyes still darting into the darkness. That's when we heard it. A faint rustling in the bushes, like something was moving just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was slow, deliberate, too loud to be the wind. I swung the flashlight around again, the beam cutting through the night. But whatever it was, stayed hidden. We sat in tense silence, straining to hear, but the sound faded away. After a while, Laura managed to calm Scout down, though he kept his eyes on the trees, his body tense. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but that sense of unease lingered. It wasn't the first time I'd heard animals moving around the woods at night while camping, but this was different. There was something deliberate about the sound, something almost too cautious. The next day, we decided to take a hike up the ridge nearby. It was one of those beautiful autumn mornings, crisp and bright, with the sun filtering through the trees in golden beams. The hike helped shake off the tension from the night before. We climbed for a few hours, Scout bounding ahead, his usual energetic self. By the time we got back to camp, the uneasy feeling from the night before was almost forgotten. But that evening, just as the sun was dipping behind the trees, things took a turn. I was gathering some wood for the fire when I noticed something strange. In the clearing, about 30 yards from our campsite, there was something hanging from a low branch. I thought it was a bundle of leaves at first, caught up in the wind, but as I got closer I realized it wasn't leaves at all. It was fur. Not just any fur, though. It was black and matted, tied together with bits of twine and something else. Small bones, maybe? It hung there, swaying gently in the breeze. My stomach churned. I hadn't seen it the day before, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't been there until recently. I called Laura over and we both stared at it, confused and unsettled. "What is that?" she asked, her voice shaky. "I don't know," I replied, pulling it down to get a closer look. It was crudely tied together, like someone had made it on the fly. The bones were small, too small to be anything big, maybe a bird or some kind of rodent. But it was the fur that bothered me. It looked fresh. Scout was whining again, pacing around the campsite, his eyes darting toward the trees. We decided to ignore it. Maybe it was some weird art project from a previous camper or some hunter's strange good luck charm. It didn't matter. We were out here to enjoy the weekend, and I wasn't about to let some creepy totem ruin that. But that night, the woods were different. The silence that had felt peaceful before now felt oppressive. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig seemed amplified in the dark. Scout wouldn't settle, pacing around the tent, growling at intervals. I lay there staring at the ceiling of the tent, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Then the tapping started. It was soft at first, like someone gently rapping on a tree just beyond the campsite. Tap, tap. Then silence. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from all around us, echoing through the woods. Laura sat up, her eyes wide with fear. I grabbed the flashlight, my hand shaking, and shined it outside the tent. The fire had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. Then I heard it, a soft, lilting voice, barely a whisper, carried on the wind. Come. It was distant, almost impossible to hear, but there was no mistaking it. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice, and it was calling us. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. I turned in every direction, scanning the tree line with the flashlight. But there was nothing. Then the tapping grew louder. I shined the light toward the trees where the sound was coming from, and that's when I saw it, just for a second. A shape, pale, human-like but twisted, with long, gaunt limbs and a face that looked wrong, its eyes too large and black, its mouth too wide, grinning. It darted behind a tree before I could focus the light on it, but I knew what I had seen. Laura was at my side now, clutching Scout's leash. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't argue. We packed up as quickly as we could, the tapping growing more frantic with every passing second. The voice was louder now, insistent. "Come." We left most of our gear behind, grabbing only what we needed, and started running. Scout pulled ahead, barking wildly as we made our way through the trees, the sound of the tapping following us. I kept the flashlight trained ahead, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't until we reached the car that the sound finally stopped. We didn't speak the entire drive home. When we got back to town, I went online, trying to find any explanation for what we had experienced. That's when I found the stories about the Wendigo, a creature said to roam the woods, luring people with whispers, tapping on trees to disorient them, stalking them until they're lost and alone. We haven't gone camping since, but sometimes late at night when the wind is just right, I think I hear it, the tapping, and the voice. I'm a park ranger stationed at a remote outpost in the northern stretches of the Appalachian Mountains. The forest here is dense, ancient, and unsettling. On a good day, it's beautiful. Wild flowers swaying in the cool breeze, birds chirping above the rustle of leaves, the faint scent of pine hanging in the air. But when the sun dips behind the ridges and the shadows grow long, the woods transform into something else entirely. That night started like any other. I was alone in the ranger's cabin, my only company a cup of strong coffee and the crackling of a fire that barely cut through the creeping chill. Outside, the wind howled, making the trees groan like old bones. The radio, usually full of chatter from other rangers or the occasional camper, had been dead silent for hours. It wasn't unusual this far out. Sometimes signals just didn't get through, but something about the quiet unnerved me. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. After all, I'd been here for nearly 3 years and had gotten used to the solitude. But that night, there was something different. It was subtle at first, a strange sound from outside, like twigs snapping but closer, deliberate. Not the random noise of a forest, but something moving. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The air was thick with mist, swirling between the trees like smoke. The beam of my light barely pierced the fog. For a moment I listened. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie absolute silence, and then I heard it. A low growl, so faint I almost convinced myself it wasn't real. But it was there, just beyond the reach of my light. My hand instinctively went to the radio at my belt, but I stopped. I didn't know what I'd say, and besides, I was probably just spooking myself. I took a step forward, boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting together like fingers clawing at the sky. Something moved in the corner of my eye. Just a shadow, I told myself. But when I turned the light, there was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The fog seemed to thicken, closing in around me. I was about to turn back when I heard another sound. A whispering, almost like words carried on the wind. I froze, heart pounding. It didn't make sense. No one else should be out here, not this deep into the forest, not at this time of night. Help! The voice was faint, barely audible, but I heard it. A woman's voice. My throat tightened. The first rule of the woods is never ignore a cry for help, no matter how unlikely. People get lost, turned around, and the forest can swallow them whole. But this voice, something about it felt wrong. Too soft, too distant, like it wasn't coming from any one direction. Help me! Against every instinct telling me to turn back, I followed the sound. The trees thickened as I moved deeper into the forest, their branches closing in, twisting into unnatural shapes. My breath puffed in the cold air, the mist clinging to me like a second skin. Every step I took was followed by another noise behind me, footsteps. But when I stopped, they stopped. I spun around, shining my light into the woods. Nothing. Just the thick, oppressive fog. But the footsteps didn't belong to the forest. They belonged to someone, or something. Then I saw it, movement between the trees. A shadow darting from one trunk to the next, too fast for me to focus on. My heart raced as I quickened my pace, trying to catch up. The voice called again, closer this time. Please, help. I broke through a line of trees into a small clearing. In the center stood a woman, her back to me, her clothes torn and dirty, hair hanging in tangled clumps. Relief washed over me. She was real. She was here. I wasn't imagining it. Ma'am, I called, rushing toward her. Are you hurt? What happened? She didn't move, didn't turn around. The air grew still, and an icy chill gripped my spine. Something was wrong. I slowed my steps, every instinct screaming at me to stop. But I was too close to turn back. And then she moved. Slowly, unnaturally, her head twisted around, far too far, until her eyes locked onto mine. They weren't human. They were black, completely black, with no whites, no pupils, just endless voids. Her mouth hung open in a twisted, unnatural grin, revealing too many teeth, sharp and gleaming in the pale moonlight. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my grasp. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But there was no making sense of it. It was wrong, something out of a nightmare. Suddenly, the sound of growling surrounded me, low and guttural, like a pack of wolves closing in. But it wasn't wolves. I glanced around, frantically searching the darkness, and that's when I saw them. Figures moving between the trees, hunched, tall, their limbs too long, their eyes glowing red in the shadows. Dog-like faces with human-like features, dogmen. I had heard of them. Whispers among the other rangers. Legends of creatures that roamed these forests, but I had never believed them, not until now. The woman creature's grin widened, and she let out a guttural, inhuman sound, a mix of laughter and a growl. Behind her, one of the dogmen stepped into the clearing, towering over her, its eyes locked onto me. I turned and ran, branches whipped at my face, the cold air burning my lungs as I sprinted through the forest. The growls followed closer and closer, and I could hear the pounding of paws or feet behind me. They were hunting me, playing with me. I stumbled over a root and hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of me. As I scrambled to my feet, I saw them in the distance, silhouettes against the fog, tall, twisted figures moving on all fours but with an unnatural, jerking gait. I heard the whispering again, the woman's voice blending with something deeper, darker. "You'll never leave." I forced myself to my feet and ran, adrenaline driving me forward, my body moving on instinct alone. The cabin wasn't far now. If I could just make it there, lock the door, radio for help. The footsteps behind me stopped. I slowed, panting, my breath coming in ragged gasps. And then I saw it. Standing on the porch of the cabin was a figure. It was me, my own face staring back at me, my own eyes wide with terror. But it wasn't me. It couldn't be. The figure smiled, a cruel, twisted smile, the same as the woman in the clearing. A skinwalker. Everything I thought I knew, everything I believed about this forest shattered in that moment. The legends were real. The stories, the whispers, they were all warnings, and I had ignored them. The figure stepped toward me and I backed away, heart pounding, legs trembling. There was no escape. They had me. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was that voice, soft and mocking, echoing through the trees. "Now you belong to the woods." And then silence. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. A group of friends, me, Jamie, Claire, and Marcus, had all planned a camping trip to escape the grind of city life. We'd found this spot online, tucked away deep in the national forest, miles from any town or other campers. It promised isolation, serenity, and that perfect sense of being lost in nature. But now, sitting here by the fire on our second night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were too alone. The forest around us was thick, the kind of thick that swallowed sound. Our fire was the only thing that seemed to hold back the darkness, but just barely. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves in the distance made me jump, though I tried to hide it from the others. We'd all been telling stories, but none of us could ignore the growing tension in the air. Jamie poked at the fire, breaking the silence. "We're not alone out here, you know." Claire raised an eyebrow. "Okay, don't start. This place is creepy enough without you trying to scare us." "I'm serious," Jamie continued, glancing around the shadowy trees. "There are things in these woods, older than people, older than memory. You can feel it, right?" Marcus snorted, brushing it off as usual. "Come on, man. You're gonna freak Claire out. We'll all start jumping at shadows next." Jamie ignored him, staring into the fire as he spoke. "I heard a story about this forest. People don't come back from here, not always. Sometimes the woods take them, change them. It's not like getting lost, it's something different." I frowned. Jamie loved to mess with us, but something in his voice was different now. He wasn't smiling or laughing. He wasn't playing around. "They say," Jamie continued, his voice low, "that the forest can hear you. It listens. It knows your name. And if you're not careful, if you wander too far from the fire, it calls you." There was a beat of silence, broken only by the popping of the fire and the far-off chirp of a lone cricket. I felt a chill run down my spine. Marcus shook his head, standing up. "That's enough of that. You're full of it. I'm going to grab more firewood." "Don't go too far," Jamie said softly, not looking up. Marcus just waved him off and disappeared into the trees, his flashlight bobbing through the darkness. I shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Claire, who seemed equally uneasy. "Maybe we should have gone with him," she muttered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "It's fine," I said, more to convince myself than anyone else. "He's just grabbing wood. He'll be right back." But as we sat there, the silence of the forest seemed to grow heavier. The fire felt smaller, dimmer, like the shadows were closing in around us. And then, from somewhere in the woods, we heard it. Soft at first, but unmistakable. A voice. "Guys?" I jumped, looking toward the trees. It was Marcus, his voice distant, but we couldn't see him. "Guys?" The voice called again, a little closer now. "Where are you?" Something was off. The voice. It sounded like Marcus, but flat, almost hollow. There was no frustration, no urgency, just that same monotone, repeating the same question. "Guys?" Claire leaned toward the fire, her face pale. That doesn't sound right. Shouldn't he be back by now? Jamie stood up, shining his flashlight toward the trees. Marcus? No answer, just the distant echo of the same voice. Guys? I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. That's not him, I whispered, barely loud enough for anyone to hear. That's not Marcus. Jamie turned to me, his face serious. Stay by the fire. I didn't argue. I couldn't. My body was frozen with fear as Jamie stepped toward the woods, the beam of his flashlight sweeping back and forth. Claire grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. What's happening? She whispered. I didn't know. I couldn't explain it, but everything inside me screamed that something was wrong. Horribly, deeply wrong. Marcus, stop messing around, Jamie shouted into the darkness. His voice echoed back, unanswered. The wind seemed to pick up, carrying with it a faint rustling in the trees. Or was that footsteps? Then from the trees Marcus appeared. Or at least, it looked like Marcus. He stepped into the glow of the firelight, his face blank, his eyes dull and empty. He stood there motionless, staring at us. Marcus? Jamie said, his voice uncertain now. Marcus smiled, but it wasn't his smile. It was too wide, too forced, stretching his lips into something unnatural. My blood ran cold. Guys, Marcus said, his voice slow, deliberate. It's safe now. Come with me. Jamie took a step back. What the hell, man? Are you all right? But Marcus didn't respond. He just stood there staring at us with that eerie, vacant smile. And then, slowly, his head tilted to the side, too far, like his neck was made of rubber. Come with me, he repeated, his voice almost mechanical now, like he was reading from a script. Claire gasped, her grip on my arm tightening painfully. That's not Marcus. I didn't need convincing. Everything about him, his stance, his voice, the way his eyes gleamed in the firelight. It was wrong. Completely wrong. My heart pounded in my chest as Jamie slowly backed toward the fire, his face pale. Marcus, what's wrong with you? Jamie whispered. But Marcus, or whatever was pretending to be him, just smiled wider. His head tilted further until it looked like it might snap off. Come into the woods, he said softly. But it wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. Then behind him, deep in the trees, I saw it. A shadow. Something tall, gaunt, its limbs too long, its face obscured by the darkness. It watched us, its hollow eyes gleaming in the night. Jamie grabbed my arm, pulling me to my feet. We need to go. Now. We didn't wait. We didn't even look back at Marcus, or whatever was standing there in his place. We ran. We ran as fast as we could, crashing through the trees, the darkness swallowing us whole. Behind us I could hear footsteps, too many footsteps, chasing us, following close, too close. Come back, a voice called, not Marcus's voice, something else. Come back. We didn't stop until we reached the car out of breath, our hearts pounding, adrenaline surging through our veins. We piled in, slammed the doors, and Jamie floored it, speeding down the dirt road, kicking up dust in our wake. We never found Marcus. When we returned with search parties the next day, there was no trace of him. No sign of the creature that had taken his form. Just the cold, silent forest, waiting. I still hear his voice sometimes, though, in my dreams, in the distance, when I'm alone. Come back. And I wonder, was it really Marcus, or was it the forest calling me too? I'd always preferred camping alone. Something about the solitude, the quiet of the woods, the distance from everything, people, responsibilities, made me feel like I could breathe again. I wasn't some weekend warrior who needed a big group of friends and a cooler full of beer to enjoy the outdoors. No, I craved the isolation. I craved the peace. That's why I found myself deep in Pine Hollow Forest on a crisp autumn weekend, setting up camp miles from the nearest trailhead. The air was cool but not biting. The leaves had turned vibrant shades of orange and red, and the scent of pine hung in the air. It was perfect. I had chosen a spot by a small creek, tucked away from any signs of civilization. The only sounds were the gentle flow of water and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. After pitching my tent and gathering some wood for the fire, I settled in for what I expected to be a quiet, relaxing night under the stars. As dusk fell, I lit the fire and watched as the flames flickered and danced in front of me. The temperature dropped with the setting sun, but the fire's warmth kept the chill at bay. I leaned back, staring up at the canopy of trees, feeling the kind of calm that only comes from being completely alone in nature. But as the night wore on, that calm slowly began to unravel. It started with a sound so faint I thought I'd imagined it at first, a distant crunching of leaves like footsteps. Not constant, just every now and then, like someone, or something, was moving around in the woods beyond my campsite. I listened carefully, straining to hear more, but everything went silent again. I shook my head, laughing at myself. Of course, there were animals out here. I was in the middle of the forest, after all, probably just a deer or a raccoon scuffling around. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about this night, like the woods were holding their breath. Time passed and the fire began to die down. I added a few more logs, watching the embers glow and crackle. The sound of the creek, once soothing, now felt almost unnervingly loud in the silence that surrounded me. Then I heard it again, this time clearer. A snap of a twig, unmistakably human in its rhythm. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. It was closer now, maybe just beyond the tree line, where the darkness swallowed everything outside the reach of the firelight. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and fragile in the night. No answer. Just more silence. I stood up, scanning the trees with my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing. No movement. No sign of anything. Just shadows and the sway of branches in the wind. I told myself it was an animal again, but my gut was twisting with unease. I sat back down, but the peacefulness of the night was gone. Every sound now felt amplified. The creak of the trees, the rustle of leaves, even my own breathing seemed too loud. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something standing at the edge of my camp, watching. The fire was beginning to die again, and this time I didn't bother stoking it. I wanted the darkness. I wanted to blend in, to disappear. The feeling of being watched was gnawing at me, and I thought maybe if I let the fire go out, whatever or whoever was out there would lose interest. But then, just as the last flames flickered and sputtered out, I heard it. Footsteps, close, too close. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam weak but still cutting through the thick night. I pointed it toward the sound, and for a moment I saw nothing. Just the trees and the impenetrable blackness of the forest. Then something moved. It was subtle, barely noticeable at first, a shifting of shadows. But as I stared, I saw it. A figure, standing between the trees, just outside the reach of the light. It was tall, too tall, with limbs that seemed unnaturally long. Its head was tilted to the side, as if it were studying me, watching my every move. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep the panic from creeping into my voice. No response, just the figure, standing motionless, watching. I backed away slowly, my pulse racing, my mind scrambling for a rational explanation. Maybe it was a person, some hiker who'd lost their way, maybe. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something wrong with it. Something about the way it stood. Too still. Too quiet. I kept the flashlight trained on the figure, my hands trembling. Then, without warning, it moved. Not toward me, but sideways, slipping between the trees with a sickening fluidity that made my stomach churn. The way it moved, it was like it wasn't bound by the same rules as the rest of us. It was too fast, too smooth. and then it was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. My flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into complete darkness. I fumbled for my phone, desperate for any source of light, but as soon as I turned it on, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. There, on the ground, just inches from where I stood, were footprints. Fresh, deep footprints in the dirt. They led from the edge of the trees, straight toward my tent. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, and saw the tent flap gently swaying in the breeze. I hadn't left it open. I wasn't alone. I stepped back, eyes wide, trying to keep my breathing steady. Slowly, silently, I reached into my backpack, grabbing the small hatchet I always carried for chopping wood. My fingers tightened around the handle, my knuckles white. I don't know how long I stood there staring at the tent, waiting for something to move, to emerge, but nothing happened. The woods were still, silent, too silent. I couldn't stay. I knew that much. But running blindly into the woods didn't feel like an option either. Whatever was out there, it was watching, waiting. I took a deep breath, gripping the hatchet tighter, and slowly began to back away from the tent. And that's when I heard the zipper. Slow, deliberate, the sound of the tent unzipping from the inside. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed as the flap of the tent opened. But nothing came out. Just that same unnatural stillness, the feeling that something was waiting just beyond my sight, just beyond the veil of darkness. I took another step back, my heart thundering in my chest. Then a voice, low and guttural, broke the silence. "Come back." It wasn't my voice, it wasn't anyone's voice. It sounded like it had been pulled from the earth itself, twisted and warped. My legs moved before I even made the conscious decision. I ran. I ran harder and faster than I'd ever run in my life, not daring to look back, not caring if it was following. I didn't stop until I reached my car, gasping for air, sweat pouring down my face. As I fumbled with my keys, I finally glanced back toward the woods, expecting to see that figure, that thing, standing at the tree line. But the woods were empty, still, waiting. I didn't look back again as I drove away, the sound of my tires crunching over the gravel road the only proof that I had made it out. But as I lay awake that night, safe in my bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, something I couldn't see, but could still feel. And every so often in the dead of night, I swear I can hear that voice again, whispering, "Come back." There's a stretch of forest near my hometown that people tend to avoid. It's not marked on any map, and it doesn't even have a name. The locals just call it the Black Woods. Growing up, we all heard the stories, how people who went in didn't always come out. Or if they did, they came back different. I never put much stock in it. Figured it was the usual small-town folklore designed to scare kids away from exploring too far. But when my friend Mark suggested we camp out there for a weekend, I hesitated. I wasn't afraid, just cautious. But Mark had this way of egging people on, and before I knew it, we were planning the trip. There were 4 of us, me, Mark, his brother Kyle, and another friend named Sam. We were all seasoned campers, confident we could handle a weekend in some spooky woods without losing our minds. We packed our gear and headed out early on a Friday morning, ready for whatever adventure awaited us. The first few miles were easy enough. The forest seemed normal, dense trees, dappled sunlight, the earthy smell of moss and pine needles. But as we ventured deeper, something changed. The air grew heavier, colder, even though it was the middle of summer. The light seemed to dim, like the canopy above was thickening, blocking out the sun. The further we went, the more it felt like we were walking into a tunnel, the world outside slowly fading away. By the time we reached a suitable clearing to set up camp, it was late afternoon, though the forest was already drenched in shadow. There was something about the place that set my teeth on edge. The trees here were older, gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The ground was soft and damp, covered in a thick layer of dead leaves that crunched underfoot. None of us said anything about the strange atmosphere. Mark made a few jokes to lighten the mood, but even he seemed uneasy. We set up camp, gathered firewood, and by dusk we had a decent fire going. The flames flickered, casting long dancing shadows against the trees. That's when the sound started. At first it was subtle, a rustling in the underbrush like an animal moving through the leaves. But it didn't sound right, too deliberate, too rhythmic. We figured it was just some wildlife and tried to ignore it, but the rustling didn't stop. It circled the camp, moving from one side to the other, always just beyond the reach of the firelight. Mark laughed it off. "Probably just a raccoon," he said, though his voice didn't sound quite as confident as before. But as the night wore on, the noises grew louder. Footsteps, heavy, crunching footsteps, joined the rustling. At first, we tried to convince ourselves it was just an animal, a deer, maybe. But there was no way it was an animal. The steps were too measured, too purposeful. Whatever it was walking around our camp, watching. Sam was the first to suggest we call it a night. No one argued. We put out the fire, crawled into our tents, and tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come easy. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, moving through the trees. Every so often they would stop, right outside one of our tents, before picking up again. My heart was racing, my body rigid with fear, but I didn't dare move. I didn't dare make a sound. Sometime in the middle of the night, the footsteps stopped altogether. The silence was suffocating, the kind that presses down on you and makes you aware of every breath, every heartbeat. I lay there, staring at the thin fabric of my tent, waiting for something to happen. And then I heard the zipper. It was faint at first, like someone was slowly unzipping a tent. I held my breath, straining to listen. Another zipper, this time louder, clearer. One of the others must have been getting out. But why? "Mark," I whispered, but no one answered. The zipper kept going, slow and deliberate, like whoever was unzipping the tent was savoring the sound. I heard the soft rustle of movement outside, the shuffle of footsteps. My stomach dropped. Something wasn't right. I unzipped my own tent just a fraction, enough to see into the clearing, my flashlight gripped tightly in my hand. The fire had long since died, but the pale light of the moon filtered through the trees, casting an eerie glow over the camp. That's when I saw him. Mark was standing outside his tent, his back to me, unmoving. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, rigid as a statue. I called his name again, but he didn't respond. I watched as he slowly tilted his head, as if listening to something. Then, with stiff, unnatural movements, he began walking toward the trees, disappearing into the darkness. "Mark," I called out louder this time, stepping out of my tent, but he was already gone. I turned toward Kyle and Sam's tents. Their zippers were open too. I rushed over, pulling the flap back, but the tents were empty. They were all gone. Panic clawed at my throat. I grabbed my flashlight, my heart pounding as I stepped into the forest, calling their names. But the only response was the oppressive silence. The trees loomed overhead, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to reach for me. That's when I heard it. A whisper, faint and distant, coming from deep within the woods. It was so soft I almost didn't catch it, but it was there. My name. "Ben?" I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. It was Mark's voice, but it sounded wrong. Like he was struggling to form the words, his voice distorted, stretched. "Ben." The whisper came again, closer this time. I shone my flashlight into the trees, but all I could see were dark trunks and tangled branches. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. "Ben, come here." The voice was right behind me now, but when I spun around, there was no one there. That's when I saw the figure. At the edge of my flashlight's beam, a shape emerged from the shadows. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its limbs long and twisted like the trees around it. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, they were wrong. Too big, too black, and they seemed to shimmer in the darkness. I took a step back, my heart slamming against my chest, but my legs felt like lead. The thing tilted its head, mimicking the way Mark had before he disappeared. And then, in that same distorted voice, it spoke again. "Come closer, Ben." I didn't wait. I ran. I don't remember how I got back to the trailhead. The next thing I knew, I was stumbling out of the forest, breathless, terrified, with no idea how long I'd been running. I flagged down the first car I saw and got the hell out of there. The police searched the woods for days, but they never found Mark, Kyle, or Sam. No tents, no gear, not even footprints. It was as if they had never been there at all. But I know what I saw, and I know that something lives in those woods, something that's been there far longer than any of us. And it's waiting. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. That was the beauty of solo camping. No schedules, no checking in, no distractions. Just me and the wild. Pinecrest Forest had always been one of my favorite places for this kind of trip. Deep, untamed woods that seemed to stretch on forever, with hidden lakes and quiet streams far from the tourist trails. I knew it well, or at least I thought I did. That weekend, I picked a spot far from the usual campsites, a place I'd scouted out on a hike a few years ago. No one would be around for miles. The isolation was thrilling at first, exactly what I wanted. I pitched my tent by a narrow creek, the water babbling softly under the orange and purple hues of the setting sun. As the evening rolled in, I felt a calm settle over me. I watched the fire crackle, listened to the sounds of the forest at dusk, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the wind. Everything felt right, peaceful even. But that feeling didn't last long. It was around midnight when I first noticed the change. I had been lying in my tent, eyes half closed, when the forest sound suddenly stopped. It wasn't gradual. One moment, the woods were alive with insects and the soft croaking of frogs by the creek, and the next, silence. I sat up, ears straining. I've been in enough forest to know that silence isn't a good sign. Silence means something is wrong. Something bigger than the usual animals was out there. Something that had unsettled the entire forest. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out of the tent, scanning the trees. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating only the bare trunks of pines and the thick brush between them. Nothing moved, no sound. I called out, a soft, uncertain, "Hello?" But it felt absurd. I didn't expect anyone to answer. But something did. It started as a faint tapping, like fingers drumming on wood, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. It was subtle at first, almost like it was mimicking the sound of branches creaking in the wind, but there was no wind, and the rhythm was too deliberate, too precise. Tap, tap, tap. I shone the flashlight in the direction of the noise, my pulse quickening. The tapping stopped. My breath hung in the air, clouding the beam of light. Then, just as quickly as it had stopped, it started again, closer this time. Tap, tap, tap. My heart raced. The tapping wasn't just a sound, it was a signal, something trying to get my attention, or worse, trying to communicate. I backed away slowly, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I had camped alone dozens of times, but this was different. This was wrong. I heard the sound of something moving through the underbrush, the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot. It was coming toward me, deliberate and slow. I tried to focus the light, but the beam caught only glimpses of movement between the trees, just flashes of motion, too fast to make out. That's when I heard the voice. At first it was barely a whisper carried on the cold night air. "Help me." It was soft, pleading but broken like it hadn't been used in years. It came from the same direction as the tapping. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. The woods swallowed the sound, offering no reply. Then, again, the voice, louder this time. "Help. Me." It was unmistakably human but distorted, wrong in a way that set every nerve in my body on edge. It didn't sound like someone in danger. It sounded like someone pretending to be in danger. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I realized the voice wasn't moving. It wasn't getting closer. It was just there, calling out. I didn't respond. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to pack up and get the hell out of there. But I couldn't. My feet felt glued to the ground, my body frozen between fear and curiosity. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing just at the edge of the flashlight's range, tall and thin, but not in any natural way. It was hunched, its body misshapen, as though it had been stretched too far. And it was looking at me, or at least I think it was. Its face was a blur, as though the darkness was distorting it, but I could feel its gaze. The figure shifted, its head tilting at an odd angle. The tapping started again, louder now, coming from all around me. The figure didn't move, but the tapping grew more frantic, faster, as if it was trying to match the rhythm of my racing heart. I turned and ran, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my grip as I sprinted back to my tent. My lungs burned, my mind screaming at me to keep moving. But as I reached the clearing, I froze in my tracks. The figures were there. 3 of them now, standing around the edges of my campsite, watching silently, their twisted bodies barely visible in the darkness. The tapping stopped. I stood, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And then, in unison, they moved. Not toward me, but closer to each other, as if circling something I couldn't see. Their movements were jagged, unnatural, like marionettes being pulled by invisible strings. The air was thick with the stench of decay, something sour and ancient, seeping into my lungs with every breath. Suddenly one of them spoke. "Help! Me!" The same voice, the same broken, twisted plea. But this time all 3 of them said it, their voices overlapping in a grotesque harmony. "Help me!" I staggered back, my legs barely able to hold me up. My mind screamed to run, but my body refused to obey. The figures stepped closer to each other, their movements becoming more frantic, more erratic, until they were almost a blur of limbs and shadows. Then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. The figures stood still, silent, their heads tilting in unison as they turned to face me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And then, they whispered, in perfect sync, "You shouldn't have come." The woods around me erupted in noise, twigs snapping, branches breaking, leaves rustling, and suddenly I was running. I don't remember making the decision to flee, but my legs carried me, adrenaline fueling every step. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran until the first light of dawn broke through the trees, my body aching, my mind racing with the images of what I'd seen. When I finally stumbled back to my car, panting and drenched in sweat, I glanced one last time at the edge of the forest. There was nothing there, no figures, no tapping, just the normal, peaceful sounds of the forest waking up. I never went back to Pinecrest Forest, and to this day I don't know what those things were or what they wanted. But sometimes, in the dead of night when I'm alone and the house is quiet, I hear it again. Tap, tap, tap. It started as a weekend escape, a way to disconnect from our lives in the city and immerse ourselves in nature. Me, Ryan, Jess, and Kate had planned this camping trip for months, eagerly anticipating the peaceful isolation of Black Hollow Forest. It was remote, quiet, and as we had been told by a few locals, one of the most untouched forests left in the state. We didn't expect much beyond hiking, stargazing, and campfire stories. I wish we had stayed far, far away. We arrived at Black Hollow late in the afternoon, just as the sun was dipping behind the towering pines. The forest had a stillness to it that was both calming and unsettling. It felt different, like it was watching us. Jess, the most experienced camper, found a perfect spot near a clearing, and we set up our tents. The evening crept in fast, the warmth of the fire a small comfort, as shadows lengthened across the trees. "Did you hear that?" Kate asked after a while, breaking the comfortable silence. She had a habit of being a little jumpy, but her voice had an edge of real concern. We all stopped and listened. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. No usual night sounds, no crickets, no owls, just an eerie silence stretching on like the calm before a storm. Probably nothing, Ryan shrugged, tossing another log on the fire. The crackle of the flames was the only thing keeping the oppressive quiet at bay. But then I heard it too. A distant sound, faint at first, like the wind carrying a voice, calling. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a cry for help. Jess stood up, squinting into the dark woods. Someone's out there. None of us moved for a moment. We all just stared into the forest, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. Then Ryan grabbed a flashlight. We should go see if someone's lost. I didn't want to leave the fire. That sense of being watched only grew stronger, more oppressive, like the forest itself was pressing in around us. But Ryan was already heading into the trees, and Jess followed close behind. "Stay here with Kate," Jess said over her shoulder. "We won't go far." Kate and I sat in tense silence, listening as Ryan and Jess's footsteps faded into the woods. The light from their flashlight danced among the trees, then disappeared completely, swallowed by the night. A minute passed, then 5, then 10. I couldn't stand the waiting anymore. "I'm going after them," I said, standing up and grabbing my own flashlight. "Stay here by the fire." Kate just nodded, her eyes wide with fear, clutching her knees as though that would keep her safe. I didn't want to leave her, but the silence that followed Ryan and Jess's departure gnawed at me. I stepped into the woods, calling their names. The trees were dense, the flashlight's beam barely cutting through the darkness. My breath was loud in the still air, the only sound aside from my feet crunching on dead leaves. "Ryan? Jess?" I called out, but there was no answer. Just that heavy, unnatural silence. I don't know how far I walked before I saw it, a light flickering up ahead. My heart leaped. They must have found someone, I thought. But as I got closer, I realized the light was wrong. It wasn't a flashlight, but a lantern, a soft yellow glow swaying gently in the air. And beneath it stood a man. He wore a park ranger uniform, his broad-brimmed hat shadowing his face. The strangest thing, though, was how still he was. Not a twitch or a shift in weight. Just standing there, watching. I felt an icy shiver run down my spine. "Are you looking for someone?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. The ranger didn't respond at first, and when he finally did, his voice sounded strange, like it was coming from somewhere deep in his throat, as if he hadn't spoken in years. "You shouldn't be out here." "I'm with my friends," I said. "They went into the woods and "You need to leave," he interrupted, his head tilting ever so slightly. "This forest, it belongs to them." My skin prickled with dread. "Them? Who are you talking about?" He didn't answer. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his lantern casting strange, shifting shadows across his face. I took a step back instinctively, and that's when I saw it, the way his legs bent at an unnatural angle, as if his joints weren't quite right. A horrible realization hit me all at once. This thing was not human. I turned and ran. The forest felt different now, twisted. The trees were closer together, the path more narrow. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I stumbled, desperate to get back to the fire, back to Kate. When I burst into the clearing, panting and wild-eyed, I found Kate standing by the fire. But she wasn't alone. Standing beside her, holding a lantern, was the ranger. "Kate, get away from him," I shouted, but Kate just stared at me, her face pale and expressionless. Then, with a sickening crack, the ranger's head turned toward me, far too far to the side, an inhuman twist. And from his mouth came a low, rumbling growl, followed by words that froze the blood in my veins. "They're already mine." Before I could react, the thing that looked like a ranger lunged, its body contorting, shifting. For just a second its form flickered, its human skin melting away to reveal something far worse. A twisted, elongated creature, with hollow eyes and skin stretched too tight over bone. A skinwalker. I backed away, my legs shaking, but Kate didn't move. She stood there, unblinking, her eyes dull. "Kate," I whispered, and that's when I noticed the subtle twitch beneath her skin, the too still way she was standing. I had been wrong. Kate wasn't safe at the campfire. She wasn't Kate at all. The fire crackled behind them, casting long, jagged shadows as they stepped forward, their bodies shifting and breaking into unnatural shapes. I realized, with a heart-stopping certainty, that whatever had taken them wasn't planning on letting me leave either. The forest belonged to them now, and soon I would too. It's strange how the woods change at night. During the day, the forest is full of life, birds chirping, leaves rustling, and the occasional deer slipping through the brush. But when the sun sets and darkness claims the trees, it's as if the whole place holds its breath. The air grows thicker, the shadows deepen, and something in the stillness makes you feel watched. I've always loved camping, though. Something about being disconnected from the world, the raw isolation of it, appealed to me. But after this last trip, I'll never step foot in the woods again. It was a solo trip, a decision I regret more than anything now. I had chosen a remote section of the forest, one far off the beaten paths. No marked trails, no fellow campers. Just me and miles of dense, untouched wilderness. It was perfect. I wanted quiet. A few days to myself. The first night went as expected, a crackling fire, a sky so clear the stars looked like diamonds scattered on velvet, and the peaceful sounds of the forest settling in for the night. But it was the second night when things started to feel off. I had been hiking all day, exploring the deeper parts of the woods, and returned to my camp just before sunset. As I was preparing dinner, I noticed the forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no wind, not even the distant hum of insects. The stillness was unnerving, but I brushed it off. Maybe it was just that time of night. Maybe the animals were quieting down for the evening. But as the night dragged on, the silence persisted. It was around midnight when I heard it, the distant snapping of branches, heavy and deliberate. I froze, listening. The sound was far off, but it didn't belong. It was too slow for an animal, too rhythmic. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, the beam cutting through the trees, but there was nothing. No movement. No eyes reflecting back at me. Just empty forest. I tried to sleep, but my nerves wouldn't let me. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear it again, closer this time. Branches cracking, twigs snapping. Whatever it was coming toward me. I reminded myself that it could be anything, a deer, a bear even. But something about the sound, about the way it moved, felt wrong, too purposeful. Around 3 a.m., I gave up on sleeping. I was sitting by the fire, poking at the embers, when I caught the first glimpse of movement. Just beyond the tree line, something tall, too tall, slipped between the trunks. My heart pounded in my chest. I stood, straining to see, but whatever it was had vanished. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, my mind playing tricks on me in the dark, but then I heard the voice. Help. Me. It was faint, barely audible over the crackling of the fire, but it was unmistakable. A woman's voice, weak and desperate, somewhere in the woods. I grabbed my flashlight and hesitated. Every instinct told me to stay by the fire, to stay put. But the voice came again, closer this time. Please, help. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound. I walked into the trees, the beam of my flashlight sweeping the ground. I didn't get far, maybe 20 yards, before I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. There was a figure, standing perfectly still between the trees, tall and gaunt, its limbs impossibly long and thin, and its head was wrong. Too big for its body, tilted at a strange angle, as if it had been broken and left to dangle. But the worst part, the part that made me want to run back to my tent and never look behind me again, was the face. It wasn't a face at all. It was smooth, featureless skin stretched tight over bone. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale flesh. I staggered back, tripping over a root and falling hard to the ground. When I looked up again, the figure was gone, but the voice was still there. "Help me," it whispered, this time from behind me. I scrambled to my feet and ran, sprinting back toward my camp. My heart was hammering so loud I could barely hear the blood rushing in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the fire, panting and wide-eyed. I felt like I was being hunted. I collapsed into my chair, gripping my flashlight like a lifeline. I didn't hear any more sounds that night, but I didn't sleep either. The forest felt wrong, twisted somehow, like I was no longer alone, and whatever was out there was watching. The next morning I packed up camp, ready to leave as soon as possible. But when I reached the trailhead, there was a man waiting for me. He was dressed like a park ranger, standard green uniform, wide-brimmed hat, but something about him seemed off too. His eyes were too dark, too empty, his skin too pale. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "I know," I muttered, barely able to meet his gaze. "I'm leaving." He nodded, but before I could walk past him, he added, "Some things out here, they mimic what they hear, take forms you recognize, but they're not human, and they're never alone." A cold shiver ran down my spine as I looked at him. Something in the back of my mind screamed that this man, this ranger, wasn't what he seemed either. But I kept walking, my legs stiff, my heart pounding. I didn't look back, but I could feel his eyes on me the whole way. It wasn't until I was halfway home that I realized I hadn't told him about the voice I heard or what I saw. And yet he knew. And now late at night I hear it again, faint, drifting through the trees beyond my house, that same voice. "Help me." I don't answer, I don't look, but I know it's out there, waiting, and it knows where I live. I've always been a fan of off-the-grid camping. It's the only way I can feel truly disconnected, just me, the trees, and the crackling of the fire at night. I thought nothing could faze me, until last summer, when I went camping in a remote part of the national forest, one of those places where even park rangers rarely patrol. I had no idea how wrong I was about being alone. The hike-in took most of the day, but I knew the spot well, an isolated clearing near a small lake surrounded by thick pines. I'd been there twice before, but always with friends. This time it was just me and my dog, Scout. I liked it that way, no distractions, just the peace of the woods. By the time I set up camp, the sun was already dipping low. The sky was painted with streaks of orange and purple, and the lake glistened like a sheet of black glass. Scout trotted around happily, sniffing everything while I built the fire. It was a perfect evening, quiet, save for the occasional splash of a fish in the water or the rustling of wind through the trees. As night fell, I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance, enjoying the warmth against the cool air. Scout lay at my feet, his ears occasionally twitching at some distant sound. The stars above were so bright out here, far from any town or city. It was the kind of peace that sinks into your bones. For a while, I just sat there, lost in it. Then Scout stood up stiff, his fur bristling along his spine. I looked around, scanning the darkness just beyond the firelight. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, my heart starting to beat faster. I didn't hear anything at first, but Scout's reaction was enough to set me on edge. He wasn't the type to spook easily. Then came the sound, a soft, almost imperceptible rustle, like footsteps on dry leaves. Not the heavy steps of a deer or elk, but lighter, closer. I shone my flashlight toward the noise, but the beam cut through the darkness without revealing anything. The trees were just shadows on shadows, impenetrable. "Probably just a raccoon or something," I muttered, though even as I said it, I didn't believe it. Something felt wrong. The woods were too quiet now, the kind of quiet that makes your skin prickle. I tossed a couple more logs onto the fire, trying to push back the creeping darkness. Scout growled low in his throat, staring intently at the trees. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't just Scout. I could feel it too, that sensation of being watched. Then came the voice. At first it was so faint I thought I imagined it. A whisper carried on the breeze. But it grew louder, clearer. Someone calling my name. Jacob! I froze. The voice was distant, yet familiar, though I couldn't place it. It sounded like someone I knew, but their voice was distorted, like they were speaking through water. My heart thudded in my chest. Jacob. The second time was louder, coming from the tree line, from the dark where my flashlight couldn't reach. I grabbed Scout's collar, trying to keep him calm, but he was already pulling toward the trees, growling deep in his throat. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shakier than I wanted. No response. I didn't move. I just stood there, staring into the blackness, straining to hear. The voice didn't come again, but something else did. A sharp cracking of branches, like something large was moving through the brush. Something heavy. But I didn't see any movement, no eyes reflecting back at me, no shadow darting through the trees. Just that sound, growing closer. I felt a sudden wave of cold. Not like the chill of the night air, this was different. A deep, bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep up from the ground, paralyzing me. Then, from the shadows, something stepped into the faint light of my fire. At first I thought it was a person, tall, gaunt, wearing what looked like animal skins draped over its shoulders. But as it stepped closer, I realized something was horribly wrong. Its limbs were too long, its skin too pale, almost translucent in the flickering firelight. Its eyes, black, hollow, and fixed on me, were wrong, empty, dead. It didn't move like a person, it moved like something trying to be a person, its limbs jerking awkwardly, as if it had to remember how to walk. "Jacob," it rasped, the voice coming from somewhere deep in its throat, though its mouth didn't move. It was imitating me, using my name like a lure, but there was no life behind it. I stumbled back, my heart hammering against my ribs, but I couldn't look away from it. I couldn't scream, couldn't even move. It just kept walking closer, the firelight casting long, grotesque shadows across its body. Suddenly, Scout lunged, barking and snarling, snapping me out of my paralysis. I grabbed his collar, yanking him back, but he was frantic, teeth bared, pulling toward the thing. That's when it stopped, its head tilting unnaturally to one side, like it was studying me. Then, without a sound, it turned and slunk back into the trees, melting into the darkness, as if it had never been there. For a long moment I stood there gasping for breath, my hands shaking. I listened, waiting for it to return, but all I heard was the crackling of the fire and Scout's panting beside me. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't pack up either. I just sat there clutching my knife, my eyes glued to the tree line. I didn't hear the voice again, but I could feel it, the weight of its eyes lurking just beyond the edge of the firelight. When dawn finally broke, I wasted no time tearing down my camp. I grabbed my gear, leashed Scout, and hiked out as fast as my legs could carry me. As I reached the trailhead, something made me glance back. Far in the distance, just at the edge of the woods, I saw it, standing between the trees, watching me. Tall, gaunt, and wrong. I don't know what it was, and I don't think I want to. All I know is that I'll never be going back to those woods. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I think I hear it. That same voice, calling my name. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. Just me, the solitude of the woods, and a small campfire to keep the chill off. I needed the break. Life had been suffocating, stress at work, relationship falling apart. It was all too much. The deep woods, far from any cell service or responsibility, seemed like the perfect escape. I drove out early, taking winding roads that led deeper into the forest. The trees grew denser the farther I went, their towering silhouettes blotting out the sky. I arrived at the trailhead late in the afternoon, greeted by the thick scent of pine and damp earth. A weathered park ranger sat in a booth, his sun-beaten face framed by a faded green cap. "Heading in alone?" he asked, his eyes narrow beneath his brim. "Yeah, just a weekend camping trip," I replied, adjusting my pack. The ranger didn't respond immediately. His gaze shifted past me into the thick woods as if something might emerge at any moment. "Be careful," he said finally, his voice low. "People sometimes disappear out there." I laughed nervously, brushing it off as a joke, but there was no humor in his expression. His hand lingered on a worn map of the area, his fingers tracing a part marked with faded ink. "Especially around here," he added, pointing to a remote section where I'd planned to set up camp. "Why?" I asked, forcing myself to sound curious instead of rattled. "Stories," he muttered, not looking at me. "Weird stories, screams in the night, people seeing things that shouldn't be there. We're told not to talk about it. Most times it's nothing. Sometimes it's something." I nodded, trying to maintain my composure, but his words lingered like the scent of something rotting just beyond sight. I took the map, mumbled a thanks, and continued on my way. The trail wound deeper into the woods, and the deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. The trees pressed in on all sides, and the air grew colder. I found a clearing just as dusk was settling, where I set up camp, feeling uneasy without understanding why. The stillness of the forest wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an unsettling quiet that made my skin crawl. By the time the sun dipped below the tree line, I had a small fire going, but it barely seemed to push back the darkness. Shadows danced around the edge of the clearing, flickering unnaturally. I tried to shake the feeling, convincing myself I was just spooked from the ranger's warning. But then, as the fire crackled and I sipped from my canteen, I heard it. A rustling, faint but deliberate. It wasn't wind. No, this was something moving, circling the edge of my camp. I stood up, peering into the dark, my flashlight scanning the trees. Nothing. Just blackness and silence. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, but when the sound came again, this time from behind me, closer, I froze. There was something out there, and it was watching. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear the movement again, sometimes the snap of a twig, other times the crunch of leaves underfoot. But no matter how quickly I turned my head or shone my light, I saw nothing. The next morning I packed up quickly, planning to head back to the car. But as I hiked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The trail didn't look the same. It twisted and turned in ways I didn't remember. Landmarks I'd noted on the way in were missing. Trees loomed like dark sentinels, their twisted branches forming unnatural shapes. By noon, I knew I was lost. My heart pounded in my chest as I retraced my steps, or at least tried to. But no matter which direction I went, I ended up back in the same place. An ancient tree with thick, gnarled roots that seemed to pulse beneath the earth, almost alive. I was about to scream when I heard footsteps, heavy and purposeful, coming up behind me. I spun around, expecting to see another hiker or maybe a ranger. Instead, it was him, the ranger from the booth. Only now his uniform was tattered, his face pale and sunken. He moved stiffly, unnaturally, like his joints weren't working right. "I told you," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "I warned you." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. His eyes, once human, were now dark, empty voids. He stepped closer, and I stumbled back, tripping over the roots of that ancient tree. Before I could scramble to my feet, the ground beneath me shifted. The roots of the tree were moving, slithering around my legs, pulling me down. The ranger stood there, watching as I struggled, his face devoid of any emotion. "You shouldn't have come here," he murmured, his voice sounding far away now. "It doesn't like intruders." I screamed as the roots tightened around me, dragging me down into the cold, wet earth. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the ranger's hollow face, his lips twisting into a smile that wasn't human. And then I realized something horrifying. The ranger had never left the woods. He hadn't been warning me out of concern. He had been luring me here, feeding me to whatever lived beneath the trees. Because now, as the dirt filled my mouth and I felt the life drain from my body, I understood. I wasn't the first, and I wouldn't be the last. It's funny how the wilderness feels peaceful during the day, but when the sun sets, it turns into something else entirely. A living, breathing thing that watches you. I didn't believe it at first, not until I started working as a park ranger deep in the northern woods. They always tell you to respect the land, that it's ancient and that some parts of it don't belong to us. I thought it was just folklore to scare rookies like me. But now, after what I've seen, I'm not so sure anymore. My post was about as remote as it gets. 2 hours to the nearest town, no cell service, just an old radio that crackled more than it talked. I'd been assigned to monitor a sector that people rarely hiked through, dense, wild, and crawling with underbrush so thick you could barely see 5 feet ahead at times. But it wasn't just the terrain that kept people away. There were stories, whispers really, of things seen out of the corner of your eye, of voices that weren't quite right. The first few weeks were uneventful. The usual patrols, clearing trails, checking campsites. Most of the time I was alone, just me, the wind, and the rustle of trees. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. It started small, little things I could write off. One evening, I noticed strange tracks outside my cabin. Deep, misshapen footprints, almost human, but with toes too long, spaced too far apart. I brushed it off, assuming it was a bear or some other animal, though it didn't quite sit right. I wasn't an expert, but I knew animal tracks, and these, they were different. I grabbed my flashlight, scanning the tree line, but the beam only hit darkness and the twisted shapes of trees. The air was still, unnervingly so. That night I barely slept. Every creak, every rustle, I was wide awake, heart pounding. I could feel something outside, something watching. A few nights later, the whispers began. I'd be out on patrol, walking along a trail or sitting in my cabin, and I'd hear my name. Faint, but clear enough to freeze my blood. Derek, it would call, soft and slow, like a breath against my ear. But whenever I spun around, there was no one, just trees, stretching out like skeletal hands in the dim light. At first I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew better. The forest wasn't silent anymore. It had a pulse, a rhythm I could feel deep in my bones. A week passed and the whispers became more frequent. I would hear them in the middle of the day when the sun was shining, and that terrified me more than anything, because whatever was out there, it didn't care about the light. It wasn't bound by the rules I thought I understood. One night things escalated. I was finishing a late patrol when I saw it. In the distance, maybe 50 yards off, standing between the trees, someone or something, tall and lanky, its body pale, almost glowing in the moonlight. My first instinct was to call out, thinking it was a lost hiker, but as I raised my hand to wave, it turned its head toward me. Its face, God, I don't even know how to describe it. It wasn't a person. Not anymore. The eyes were too large, too black, and they didn't blink. Its mouth hung open, unnaturally wide, like it was caught mid-scream, though no sound came out. My stomach twisted, bile rising in my throat. I backed away slowly, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. But when it stepped toward me, the branches beneath its feet snapping like brittle bones, I ran. I don't know how I made it back to the cabin, but when I slammed the door shut behind me, I realized I wasn't safe. It was still out there, watching. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see it. I barricaded the door with a chair, not that it would stop whatever that thing was. The radio was dead. No way to call for help. And I was too far from town to hike out in the dark. That night was the longest of my life. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, standing just outside, grinning, waiting. But the worst part, it wasn't alone. There were more of them. I started seeing them during the day just out of the corner of my eye. A pale face between the trees, a shadow darting across the path, always just out of reach. I couldn't escape them. I was losing my mind. The final straw came a few days later. I woke up to the sound of something scratching at the cabin door. Slow, deliberate, like it was playing with me. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I peeked out the window and my heart stopped. It was me. Standing just a few feet away, wearing my clothes, my face. But its eyes were black, empty voids that stared right into me. It smiled, a grotesque, distorted version of my own face, and whispered my name again. Derek, let me in. I stumbled back, knocking over the chair, and grabbed the axe from under my bed. I wasn't going to let it take me. Whatever it was, it had been watching, waiting for the right moment. And now it was pretending to be me. As I stood there, trembling, axe in hand, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around and froze. It was my partner, Tim. He was supposed to be patrolling the northern trails. But something was off. He looked wrong. His smile too wide. His eyes too dark. "You all right, Derek?" he asked. His voice too calm, too measured. "You've been acting strange." I backed away, my heart racing. That's when I noticed his reflection in the cabin window wasn't there. It wasn't Tim. None of this was real. I don't remember much after that. Just running. Running as far and as fast as I could, away from that thing pretending to be Tim, away from the doppelganger that wore my face. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station at dawn, breathless and broken. They found me wandering the road the next day, muttering to myself, the axe still clutched in my hands. I tried to explain, but no one believed me. They said I'd been alone up there the entire time. No one had come to relieve me. No one had seen Tim in weeks. But I know what I saw, that they're still out there watching, waiting. And next time they'll find someone else to wear. There's something about the stillness of the woods at night that unnerves me now. I used to love it, the isolation, the quiet, the way the world feels like it shrinks down to just the flicker of your campfire. But after what happened last fall, I haven't set foot in the forest again. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. Just me, my girlfriend Laura, and our dog, Scout. We picked a spot deep in the national forest, a place we'd camped before. It was far from the designated campgrounds, well off any trails, a place where we could really get away. No phone signal, no other people, just the three of us in the wilderness. The drive out there took most of the day, but we reached the clearing in time to set up camp before sunset. It was the perfect spot, nestled between tall pines with a little creek running nearby. I remember standing there, taking in the smell of pine needles and earth, feeling the cool breeze brush my face. It felt like freedom. We spent the evening by the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories like we always did. Scout was dozing happily by the fire, and Laura was leaning against my shoulder, her hair smelling faintly of wood smoke. Everything felt right. But then, just after dark, Scout started acting strange. He was a calm dog, never one to bark without reason, but out of nowhere he shot up, ears pricked, and started growling low in his throat. He stared into the trees, his eyes locked on something we couldn't see. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it in the direction he was focused on, but there was nothing. Just the dark shapes of trees swaying in the wind. "Probably just a deer," I said, trying to reassure myself as much as Laura. But Scout wasn't buying it. His growl deepened, his hackles raised. He took a few steps toward the tree line, never breaking his gaze. "Come here, boy," I called, my voice tight. He ignored me, inching closer to the woods, his nose twitching like he had caught a scent. Laura grabbed his collar, pulling him back to the fire. He whined, his eyes still darting into the darkness. That's when we heard it. A faint rustling in the bushes, like something was moving just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was slow, deliberate, too loud to be the wind. I swung the flashlight around again, the beam cutting through the night. But whatever it was, stayed hidden. We sat in tense silence, straining to hear, but the sound faded away. After a while, Laura managed to calm Scout down, though he kept his eyes on the trees, his body tense. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but that sense of unease lingered. It wasn't the first time I'd heard animals moving around the woods at night while camping, but this was different. There was something deliberate about the sound, something almost too cautious. The next day, we decided to take a hike up the ridge nearby. It was one of those beautiful autumn mornings, crisp and bright, with the sun filtering through the trees in golden beams. The hike helped shake off the tension from the night before. We climbed for a few hours, Scout bounding ahead, his usual energetic self. By the time we got back to camp, the uneasy feeling from the night before was almost forgotten. But that evening, just as the sun was dipping behind the trees, things took a turn. I was gathering some wood for the fire when I noticed something strange. In the clearing, about 30 yards from our campsite, there was something hanging from a low branch. I thought it was a bundle of leaves at first, caught up in the wind, but as I got closer I realized it wasn't leaves at all. It was fur. Not just any fur, though. It was black and matted, tied together with bits of twine and something else. Small bones, maybe? It hung there, swaying gently in the breeze. My stomach churned. I hadn't seen it the day before, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't been there until recently. I called Laura over and we both stared at it, confused and unsettled. "What is that?" she asked, her voice shaky. "I don't know," I replied, pulling it down to get a closer look. It was crudely tied together, like someone had made it on the fly. The bones were small, too small to be anything big, maybe a bird or some kind of rodent. But it was the fur that bothered me. It looked fresh. Scout was whining again, pacing around the campsite, his eyes darting toward the trees. We decided to ignore it. Maybe it was some weird art project from a previous camper or some hunter's strange good luck charm. It didn't matter. We were out here to enjoy the weekend, and I wasn't about to let some creepy totem ruin that. But that night, the woods were different. The silence that had felt peaceful before now felt oppressive. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig seemed amplified in the dark. Scout wouldn't settle, pacing around the tent, growling at intervals. I lay there staring at the ceiling of the tent, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Then the tapping started. It was soft at first, like someone gently rapping on a tree just beyond the campsite. Tap, tap. Then silence. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from all around us, echoing through the woods. Laura sat up, her eyes wide with fear. I grabbed the flashlight, my hand shaking, and shined it outside the tent. The fire had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. Then I heard it, a soft, lilting voice, barely a whisper, carried on the wind. Come. It was distant, almost impossible to hear, but there was no mistaking it. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice, and it was calling us. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin. I turned in every direction, scanning the tree line with the flashlight. But there was nothing. Then the tapping grew louder. I shined the light toward the trees where the sound was coming from, and that's when I saw it, just for a second. A shape, pale, human-like but twisted, with long, gaunt limbs and a face that looked wrong, its eyes too large and black, its mouth too wide, grinning. It darted behind a tree before I could focus the light on it, but I knew what I had seen. Laura was at my side now, clutching Scout's leash. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't argue. We packed up as quickly as we could, the tapping growing more frantic with every passing second. The voice was louder now, insistent. "Come." We left most of our gear behind, grabbing only what we needed, and started running. Scout pulled ahead, barking wildly as we made our way through the trees, the sound of the tapping following us. I kept the flashlight trained ahead, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't until we reached the car that the sound finally stopped. We didn't speak the entire drive home. When we got back to town, I went online, trying to find any explanation for what we had experienced. That's when I found the stories. Stories about the Wendigo, a creature said to roam the woods, luring people with whispers, tapping on trees to disorient them, stalking them until they're lost and alone. We haven't gone camping since, but sometimes late at night when the wind is just right, I think I hear it, the tapping, and the voice. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just me and a couple of friends escaping the city for some peace in the deep woods. Chris had found a remote camping spot online, some obscure place in a national park no one seemed to visit anymore. Perfect for us, away from everything, no noise, no distractions, just nature. The drive up took hours. We lost cell service about 30 minutes into the winding roads leading deeper into the forest. At first we joked about it, how we were going off the grid, how we'd be living like cavemen for a few days. But as the trees grew denser, swallowing the light bit by bit, a sense of unease crept in. None of us said it aloud, but we all felt it. The woods didn't feel right. We finally arrived at the campsite just before dusk. The clearing was small, surrounded by thick trees that pressed in on every side. It was eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the wind. Just nothing. Chris and Jake started setting up the tents while I gathered firewood. The entire time I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. By the time we got the fire going, night had fully settled in, bringing with it a cold that seemed to seep into our bones. The flames cast flickering shadows that danced at the edge of the clearing, making it hard to tell what was real and what wasn't. We sat around the fire, eating, laughing, trying to shake off the creeping sense of isolation. But even our conversation felt forced, like we were all just waiting for something to happen. Then the sounds began. At first it was subtle. Soft footsteps in the distance, twigs snapping in the underbrush. Chris dismissed it as wildlife, probably deer or some other harmless animal. But the sounds didn't feel random. They circled us, moving from one side of the camp to the other, getting closer. Then they would stop, only to start again a few minutes later. Jake stood up, grabbing the flashlight, and pointed it into the darkness. "Probably raccoons or something," he muttered, scanning the tree line. But the beam of light revealed nothing but trees and more darkness. No glowing eyes, no movement. It went on like that for hours, the footsteps, the snapping branches, the growing tension. We tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. Something was out there, and it wasn't an animal. The fire had burned down to embers by the time the growling started. Low, deep, and guttural, like nothing I'd ever heard before. It reverberated through the clearing, making the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. We all froze, eyes wide, listening. The growling came from just beyond the tree line, hidden in the shadows where the light couldn't reach. Chris grabbed his hunting knife, standing up slowly. "Stay calm," he whispered, his voice shaking. "It's probably a wolf or a bear." But I knew better. Wolves didn't sound like that. Bears didn't circle campsites for hours without making themselves known. Whatever was out there, it was something else. The growl came again, closer this time. And then, a snap, a branch breaking under heavy weight. Something huge was moving in the woods. Jake panicked. "We need to get to the car," he said, voice high and tight. "Now." But Chris shook his head. "We can't. If it's a predator, it'll chase us down. We need to stay together, keep the fire going, and make it through the night." I wasn't sure if that was sound advice or just blind hope, but I stayed put, gripping my flashlight as if it would do anything against whatever was out there. Then we saw it. At first it was just a shape, massive and hunched, moving between the trees. The flashlight beam caught it for only a second, but it was enough. Long, matted fur, a twisted body, and eyes that gleamed like wet stones in the dark. Not an animal, not a person. Something in between. It let out another growl, louder this time, the sound vibrating in my chest. My heart was pounding, adrenaline screaming through my veins, but my body wouldn't move. It was like I was frozen in place, unable to do anything but stare at the thing lurking just beyond the firelight. Chris took a step forward, raising his knife. "Get out of here," he yelled, his voice cracking. But the thing didn't move. It just stood there, watching us. Then it laughed. A low, raspy sound that sent chills crawling down my spine. It wasn't a human laugh, more like a mockery of one, a sound that was wrong in every possible way. Jake bolted. He turned and ran into the woods before any of us could stop him, his flashlight bobbing wildly in the dark as he disappeared into the trees. "Jake!" I shouted, but it was too late. He was gone. And then, silence. The creature was gone too. Just like that. The footsteps, the growling, the presence, all of it vanished. But something worse took its place. For hours, Chris and I sat by the fire, waiting. We didn't talk. We barely moved. Every sound, every flicker of the fire made me jump. I kept expecting that thing to come back, but it never did. Then, sometime after midnight, we heard Jake's voice. "Help. Please, help me." It was faint, distant, but unmistakable. Jake's voice, calling from somewhere deep in the woods. Chris jumped to his feet. "Jake, where are you?" he shouted, but there was no response. Just that same oppressive silence. Then again, "Help me." But this time the voice wasn't quite right. It was flat, emotionless, like someone was trying to mimic Jake's voice but didn't know how. "We need to go," I whispered, standing up slowly, my legs shaky. "That's not him." Chris looked at me like I was insane. "What the hell are you talking about? It's Jake. He's out there, lost." But I knew, deep down I knew, that thing, whatever it was, it was using Jake's voice. Chris grabbed his flashlight and started into the woods before I could stop him. I stood there, alone by the dying fire, listening as he called for Jake, his voice fading into the distance. And then silence again. I don't know how long I sat there, staring into the dark, waiting for something to happen. Hours, maybe. But eventually I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Someone or something walking toward the camp. I held my breath, clutching the knife Chris had left behind, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might explode. And then I saw him. Jake stepped into the clearing, his face pale and eyes wide, a strange, crooked smile on his lips. "Hey," he said, his voice calm, almost cheerful. "I'm back." But something was wrong. His movements were stiff, unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. And that smile, it didn't reach his eyes. "Where's Chris?" I asked, my voice shaking. Jake, or whatever was wearing Jake's skin, tilted his head, the smile growing wider. "Don't worry," he said, his voice cold, empty. "You'll see him soon." That's when I realized. The thing in the woods didn't want to hunt us. It wanted to be us. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the car.